Jon Snow stood upon the ramparts of Winterfell, his cloak lifting and falling against the sharp wind, the sky above him the color of iron. The walls around him were cold with memory, etched with the faces of those who had passed from his life like fleeting ghosts. Robb and Catelyn, Ned and Rickon, countless northern bannermen who once roamed these grounds with broad smiles or solemn duty. Now he was lord of nothing, an heir to a throne he never claimed, the subject of a prophecy he did not entirely believe. Yet here, under the hard glare of the winter sun, he found himself recalling the shape of his life as though it were already written in the ancient annals of Westeros. Winds from the north carried distant echoes, the swirling promise of an older magic that haunted his blood. He was no longer the naive boy who rode to the wall with dreams of honor. He had died once, come back a changed man, and had watched the world shift beneath his feet. On this day, he found himself pondering whether the greatest shift lay yet ahead, whether destiny itself had shaped him to overthrow every monarch who subjugated the people, whether it had always been his fate to liberate. His chest felt tight when he remembered how he had once cast aside his vows to the Night's Watch, risking death and dishonor because of a simple truth: the living needed to stand together or perish. He recalled the sight of the wildlings streaming through the gates, frightened, battered, yet holding on to a spark of hope. He had liberated them from the White Walker's onslaught, bridging a gulf of hatred as old as memory. It was then that he'd first recognized the cost of liberation. His own brothers in black had turned on him, knifing him in the cold gloom of the courtyard. He had felt the warmth of his blood seep onto the frozen ground, and in that final exhalation, he had understood how few men truly yearned for change. Jon's resurrection was the first thunderous sign that his life was tethered to something greater, and though he resisted the notion that he might be chosen by any god or prophecy, the pieces fell around him with an uncanny precision. He remembered the Red Woman's trembling whisper, "The Lord of Light has plans for you," echoing between the thick stone walls as she gazed upon him with a blend of awe and fear. He had felt no triumph in that moment, only confusion and a gnawing dread that perhaps he could never again be simply Jon Snow. If destiny had indeed been laid at his feet, it seemed to twist and weave with each new turn. Returning to the seat of his father, he had found Winterfell in ruin, a shell of the home he once knew. The people who watched him from the corners of the courtyard wore their losses like tattered cloaks. Sansa had been changed by her suffering, possessing a quiet steel in her voice whenever she conferred with him about the future of the North. The lords and ladies declared him king in the North. Even then, he had thought, "This isn't right. This shouldn't be me." But the North rose behind his banner, calling him their liberator, first from the tyranny of Ramsay Bolton, whose cruelty had darkened these walls beyond measure, and then from the looming threat of the undead that lurked beyond the wall. Jon had ridden into the snows, driven not by ambition, but by the certainty that no crown mattered if the living could not stand together. And for a brief flicker in time, it seemed that all corners of the land might align under the common purpose of survival. He could still taste the bitterness of the war beyond the wall, the howling wind that flayed bare any illusions of human supremacy. Men died in droves under the unstoppable march of the Night King's legion, bones cracking beneath unholy ice. There, on the frigid battlefield, he had looked into the eyes of ancient evil and known that the fate of every kingdom hung on a single thread. It was Daenerys Targaryen who arrived with her dragons, blazing fury across the whitened plains. In that hour, Jon had felt a spark of reverence for her, a queen born on wings of fire, answering the call when so many refused to believe. She lost a dragon that day, Viserion, and his transformation into an undead beast tore open a new wound in her. From that wound, Jon glimpsed the shape of her heart, a woman who believed in freeing the world from tyranny, but who carried the Targaryen legacy of might and destruction in her blood. He admired her strength, feared her potential, and discovered an echo of kinship in her cause. He had been wary, but he had pledged himself to her, drawn by her dreams of breaking the wheel. Perhaps he had wanted to believe that there could be a better world, a world shaped by a queen whose entire being was bent toward liberation. And for a time, it seemed possible. They stood side by side in the last war against the dead, unleashing dragonfire upon the endless ranks of the Night King. They lost brave companions. The north was ravaged. Winterfell itself seemed to hold its breath, walls trembling in the endless nights as the whites came like a tide of living death. When the dawn finally broke, Jon emerged from the wreckage with a sense of bitter relief. They had won, though the cost was staggering. The illusions of unstoppable dragons and certain victory had burned away alongside the corpses. Yet there was a moment of triumph, that faint glimmer of peace as the living carried on. But Daenerys wanted more than the dawn. She wanted the Iron Throne, and she wanted to uproot every vestige of tyranny from the land. At first, Jon believed that desire was righteous. He had pledged fealty to her in good faith, a man who had grown weary of crowns and war. The secret of his own parentage had not sat comfortably on his shoulders. Being Aegon Targaryen, the true heir, felt more like a curse than a blessing. He yearned to see Daenerys usher in a new era without the madness that had plagued her forebears. And so he followed her to King's Landing, heart torn between loyalty and fear, love and an unspoken dread that something in her eyes had changed. When she rained dragonfire upon the city, the screams of innocence echoing through the ash-laden streets, Jon felt the threads of his old life unraveling. He had fought for so long to preserve life, only to see it snuffed out in a horrific storm of flames. Children died crying in the rubble, and the realm that was supposed to be freed trembled beneath a new terror. And so, in the Great Red Keep, he plunged a dagger into her heart, tears on his face as the dream of the realm's salvation turned to a nightmare in his arms. The act haunted him. Even after Drogon had taken her body and soared off into the cold gray sky, leaving behind a chasm of grief, Jon was left with the question. Was this who he was meant to be? A cursed savior, destined to bring destruction to those who claimed dominion? He had never wanted to be the harbinger of death. He returned to the north in disgrace, exiled for the murder of a queen he had once loved. The realm settled into a fragile peace under a new king, Bran the Broken, and Jon departed to the lands beyond the wall, a fugitive of royal politics, stripped of rank and title. Yet in the wilderness, as he stared at the endless tundra, he felt no closer to clarity. The spirits of the old gods whispered on the wind, pulling him back into the realm of men, reminding him that his purpose might never be fulfilled by dwelling in the fringes of the known world. Time passed, how long he wasn't certain. Seasons shifted, and the north beyond the wall thawed for brief moments. He roamed with Tormund and the free folk, forging new bonds with tribes that had once scattered to survive. He helped them find safe grounds for their clans, taught them what he had learned of agriculture, of leadership, and they in turn taught him about the old ways, the truths hidden in the frozen earth. Their wise women spoke of a champion of light who would come in times of dire need, to cast down the tyrants who would enslave souls. They spoke of how the champion's blood would pulse with ice and fire, forging a sword that could shatter lies. He listened in silence, refusing to believe that he was that champion, though something in his soul stirred. He had once united the living against the dead, liberated the wildlings from certain doom, toppled tyrants by the strength of steel and the weight of truth. But that was behind him, he thought. Hadn't he done enough? Night after night, he saw Daenerys in his dreams, her eyes filled with sorrowful accusation. She would reach out to him, and he would feel the cold grip of destiny dragging him back south. The old blood of House Targaryen and the solemn duty of House Stark warred within him. He had to remind himself that the realm now belonged to Bran, that the Seven Kingdoms had broken away into newly independent regions that sought to govern themselves. Yet rumors reached the north, carried by traders, travelers, and the occasional crow from the distant fortress of Castle Black. Tales of chaos came from the south, of lords who declared themselves kings in their own right. The realm was fracturing, each petty warlord seizing a fraction of power in the vacuum left by the Targaryen downfall. No longer unified by an iron seat, the lands of Westeros risked plunging back into endless cycles of violence. Jon tried to ignore these stories, but he was Jon Snow. He had never been able to stand idly by while innocents suffered. And so he made the long journey south again, with only a handful of free folk at his side, Tormund's laugh echoing through the cold nights as they pushed through the refortified gates of Castle Black. He found the Night's Watch smaller than ever, a handful of men still dedicated to protecting the wall, though the greatest threat, at least for now, had been vanquished. They greeted him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. To them, he was the Lord Commander who had broken his vows, died, come back, and vanished into the wild. Some whispered of him as a legend come to life. Others saw him as a ghost. He stayed only briefly, enough to gather supplies and glean more news about the southern kingdoms. Lords in the Reach had crowned themselves, it was said. In the Stormlands, Gendry Baratheon tried to hold the peace with the Stormlords, but challengers rose with claims they were the rightful heirs of old. In the Vale, Lord Royce had died under suspicious circumstances, and a new band of knights pledged fealty to a figure who claimed the name Targaryen, though no one knew the truth of that lineage. Dorne had sealed its borders. The riverlands seethed under the dominance of a tyrannical lady who taxed her small folk into ruin. Only the north, under Sansa Stark, stood relatively stable, but even their prosperity teetered under external pressures. One night, in the safety of a small chamber within Castle Black, Jon lit a single candle and stared into its flame, letting its warmth dance across his face. He thought of the vow he had taken when he joined the Watch so many years ago. It was supposed to be for life, and yet, ironically, he had given his life and been released from that vow, or so he had told himself to justify his choices. But was that a sign from the gods, or merely an invention of mortal logic? Looking at the candle, he found himself whispering, "If you are real, R'hllor, or if the old gods watch me still, tell me what I must do." Of course, there was no voice, no miracle. Only the flickering dance of orange and yellow in the darkness. He closed his eyes, fighting the ache in his chest. Images played behind his eyelids. A city in ruins, a queen lying dead, a horde of whites advancing, Sansa crowned in a quiet northern hall, Arya sailing west to unknown lands. And then, Daenerys' face, illuminated by dragonfire, eyes aflame with a terrible light. He opened his eyes and extinguished the candle with a sharp breath. He left the next morning, heading south along the King's Road. The snows had receded with the turn of the season, leaving the path muddy and treacherous. Flanked by Tormund and a few other free folk, people he trusted with his life, Jon led the small party through the lonely fields and forests of the Gift, through the edges of the now sparse riverlands. Time and again, they passed villages that bore the scars of fresh conflict. Houses were burned, fields salted. They saw corpses in ditches, crows feasting upon them. Survivors were sullen, hopeless, providing no more than a few scraps of information. Bandits roamed, armies conscripted peasants, warlords taxed them dry. He heard rumors that one warlord crowned himself king of the Trident, while another styled himself the rightful king of the Undul Hills. Each petty monarch claimed dominion and enforced it with steel. Darkness settled in Jon's heart as he witnessed the suffering. Children stared at him with hollow eyes, their parents cowering behind broken doors. An old man reached out to him, croaking through ragged breath. "They say a Targaryen must claim the throne. Which one is it now?" Jon said nothing, only gave the man a waterskin and moved on. He had never wanted the throne, but the realm was suffocating beneath the weight of countless usurpers. In the back of his mind, he recalled the stories told by the free folk seers. Perhaps he was destined to break every throne, to free the people from the cruelty of those who wielded power without mercy. He resisted the thought, but reality pressed in around him like an unrelenting tide. When he finally reached the outskirts of Harrenhal, that once mighty fortress now half-ruined and filled with squatters, he found a sight that churned his stomach. Lines of ragged men, women, and children chained together, marched toward the gates by a group of heavily armed guards. Their gaunt faces spoke of starvation, and the guards herded them like cattle, whipping any who stumbled. Wordlessly, Jon guided his companions to higher ground, peering at the spectacle. He saw the crest on the guards' armor, two black trout facing each other in a circle. He did not recognize it from any known house. A new house, perhaps, a newly minted warlord who had claimed the blackened halls of Harrenhal. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Smoke curled from within the courtyard, and Jon's stomach twisted as he realized these prisoners were likely heading to some cruel fate. Tormund spat onto the ground. "You know we can't leave them," he said quietly, a low growl in his voice. The free folk who had followed Jon were no strangers to oppression. They had seen it all their lives, from Night's Watch rangers who treated them as animals, to the constant threat of White Walkers. Now that they tasted freedom, they could not bear to see others in chains. Jon nodded, setting his jaw. He recalled the times he had tried to stand aside, to remain neutral for the sake of peace. But neutrality had never been an option for him. That night, they staged a rescue under the cover of darkness, creeping into the battered outskirts of Harrenhal, slipping between the crumbling towers and along the scorched walls. They fell upon the guards with silent ferocity, dispatching them before a cry could be raised. The freed prisoners gazed upon their rescuers with disbelief, tears glittering in the moonlight. Children clung to Jon's legs, trembling, too weak to even run. He bent down, comforting them as best he could. The older folk recognized the symbol of the direwolf on his surcoat, whispered the name Stark, and some even said Targaryen under their breath. Word spread quickly that it was the king in the north, the man who had once defeated the dead, come to liberate them. In that moment, Jon felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. It reminded him of the day the wildlings had crossed through the gates of the wall. There was a sense of desperate gratitude, but also confusion. Who was this man, and why did he save them? One trembling prisoner, a woman of no more than 20 summers, managed to whisper, "Your Grace," and Jon's entire body tensed. He wanted to say, "I'm no Grace," to cast aside the mantle, but the plea in her eyes, the reverence in her voice, demanded acceptance. People need a symbol, he thought, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. He could not thrust them back into despair simply because he feared the burdens of leadership. They guided the rescued souls away from Harrenhal that night, carrying the wounded and sharing what little rations they had. Jon heard them speak in hushed tones about how rumor said a dozen would-be monarchs claimed dominion over the riverlands, that each of them was as ruthless as the next. In the moonlight, with the towers of Harrenhal fading behind them like ghosts, Jon made a decision. They would move through the riverlands, free any imprisoned small folk they encountered, and confront the warlords who had sprung up like weeds in the fertile chaos. Perhaps it was madness. He had a mere handful of fighters with him, plus these starving refugees. Yet the moral imperative had ignited something in his chest. For better or worse, he could not turn away. It began as a small spark of rebellion in the countryside. Jon and his free folk allies, bolstered by desperate peasants with nothing left to lose, staged attacks on isolated bands of soldiers who enforced cruel local taxes. They liberated entire villages, overthrowing petty kings who had erected makeshift thrones in barns and taverns. Each victory brought more volunteers, farmers who could wield pitchforks, traveling sellswords disillusioned by the endless conflicts, and even some knights who remembered the Stark name with loyalty. The movement spread, word traveling by mouth faster than ravens. They called him the Wolf King, a name that made Jon grimace, but he soon realized names had power. To the oppressed, the Wolf King was a liberator who sought no crown. To the tyrants, he was an upstart who must be crushed. Battles raged in fields of tall grass, along narrow bridges over slow-moving rivers, and in the muddy squares of rural hamlets. Jon took no pleasure in the fighting. He had seen enough war to last lifetimes, but each confrontation was forced upon him, and each time, his ragtag forces emerged victorious, driven by the fury of those who had been beaten down too long. His Northman training combined with the ferocity of the free folk formed an unconventional force, unpredictable in tactics, relentless in spirit. It wasn't long before the self-styled King of the Trident marched against him with a considerable host, attempting to crush this rebellion once and for all. They met on the banks of the Red Fork under a sky laden with gray clouds. The enemy's banners showed a leaping trout, black on a green field, but the name of their so-called king, Edwin Rivers, meant little to Jon. He was just another opportunist who crowned himself in the wake of chaos. Yet Edwin's forces were well armed, and dwarfed Jon's volunteer army by at least 2-1. Jon felt the old dread coil in his belly, remembering the hopeless battles of the past, Hard Home, the Battle of the Bastards, the Long Night. Each time, victory had seemed impossible, yet fate had guided him through the darkness. Or had it simply been luck? As the horns sounded across the field, he glanced skyward and allowed one silent plea to whichever gods might listen. Let these people be free. The first wave of enemy cavalry thundered across the muddy plain, hooves churning the ground into a morass. Jon positioned his archers along a ridge, ordering them to hold until the horses closed in. Then, at the final moment, he gave the signal. Arrows rained down upon the cavalry, sending riders and mounts tumbling. Free folk spear-wielders rushed forward, plunging their crude but effective weapons into the chaos. Jon led a wedge of swordsmen into the fray, cutting through the terrified horses that reared and screamed. It was brutal, bloody work. Yet the tide of the cavalry broke, and the second wave of Edwin's infantry approached. Steel clashed with steel. The field echoed with the screams of dying men, the roar of defiance from the rebels. Bodies piled up in the muck, and the stench of blood filled the air. Jon fought at the forefront, his sword long-claw like an extension of his arm. The Valyrian steel glimmered with lethal grace, cutting through armor and bone with ease. At times, he saw the white wolf ghost slinking among the chaos, tearing out the throats of foes who never saw him coming. Tormund's laughter boomed like thunder, a rallying cry that lifted the rebel spirits even when their arms grew weak. Across the field, Edwin Rivers mounted a white charger and pointed a sword at Jon, bellowing, "Kill the false king!" Jon had never claimed to be a king. He set his sights on Edwin, cutting through the press of bodies with the unstoppable determination of one who has nothing left but duty. The men around Edwin, seeing Jon's approach, tried to form a shield wall, but they faltered at the fury burning in the eyes of the rebels. Jon smashed into them like a living storm, hacking through shields, driving them back with each savage blow. He felt his muscles burn, tasted blood on his tongue. He wasn't sure if it was his own or someone else's. Within moments, he stood face to face with Edwin Rivers, who raised his sword with shaky bravado. Their blades met in a ringing clash that jarred Jon's bones. Edwin was skilled. He blocked two of Jon's quick strikes and countered with a lunge toward Jon's ribs. But Jon parried, stepping inside the man's guard and driving his pommel into Edwin's face. The self-styled king staggered, blood spraying from his nose. Jon kicked him to the ground. Mud splattered, and Edwin tried to scramble away, fear etched into his features. Looking up at Jon, he rasped, "Mercy, I beg you, mercy." Jon stared down, chest heaving. The chaos of battle roared around him, though it seemed distant now. He remembered kneeling by Daenerys' side, her breath fading, and the haunting knowledge that he had taken her life to save countless others. Now another king lay before him, begging for mercy. Jon's grip tightened on Longclaw, droplets of crimson dripping from the blade. He could see the reflection of his own face in Edwin's terrified eyes. What had he become? With a sharp exhalation, Jon lowered his sword. "No more kings," he snarled, then knocked Edwin unconscious with the hilt of the blade. If the gods were kind, Edwin would stand trial before the people he tormented. That day, the rebel forces shattered the power of Edwin Rivers, and more refugees flocked to Jon's banner. They freed the riverlands from that particular tyranny, but new challengers arose as soon as the next morning dawned. At times, Jon felt he was trying to hold back a mighty ocean of greed and cruelty with a broken shield. Still, he pressed on, compelled by an unrelenting sense of duty. Town by town, fortress by fortress, he and his allies cast down those who would call themselves monarchs. And with each liberation, Jon felt the noose of destiny tighten around his soul. Word spread of his feats, and whispers reached King's Landing, where Bran the Broken's authority had diminished. The small council governed in the king's name, but many lords no longer heeded them. Jon's old friend Tyrion Lannister had attempted to maintain some semblance of unity, but the cracks widened. Some said Tyrion was close to giving up, weary of the endless debates, of the new titles and crowns that sprang up like weeds. Others claimed that if Jon truly was the last Targaryen, he had the right to lay claim to the Iron Throne, even though it no longer sat in the Red Keep, having melted under the fury of Drogon's grief. A phantom throne for a phantom king, Jon thought grimly. Eventually, Jon's travels brought him to the Crownlands. The fields outside King's Landing were littered with old wreckage from the war, charred timber and melted stone. The city's silhouette had changed. Sections of the outer walls still bore blackened scars from dragonfire. He almost expected to see Drogon, hear the roar of wings overhead, but the skies remained empty. Even so, the sight of the city stirred memories that sank teeth into his heart. He remembered climbing those steps to the throne room, remembered the ash falling like snow, remembered Daenerys' eyes, bright with a terrible fervor, as she spoke of liberating the whole world. He had believed in her dream until the moment it turned to slaughter. When he entered the city gates, accompanied by his loyal band, the people watched him with awe. They recalled his name, the Northern King who had saved them from the dead. They whispered of his Targaryen blood, speculating if he would claim the city as his own. Some cheered. Others hung back in trepidation, unsure if he would bring more war. In the heart of the city, he met with Tyrion Lannister, whose hair was now more silver than gold, lines of worry etched across his face. They spoke privately in a modest council chamber, no grand hall or throne in sight. "Well, you've certainly made a stir," Tyrion commented, regarding Jon with a weary half-smile. "Word of your liberations has arrived faster than you could. People say you are unstoppable. You realize that half the realm expects you to take the throne, and the other half is terrified you will." Jon let out a tired sigh. "I don't want it, Tyrion. I never did. And yet, you keep leading armies, overthrowing monarchs," Tyrion replied, raising an eyebrow. "I admire the spirit, truly. Westeros is drowning in self-proclaimed kings and queens, each with an appetite for cruelty. It seems you're the only one doing something about it." Jon shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his hands, scarred and calloused from endless battle. "Someone has to. People are dying." Tyrion studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward. "Listen, I've tried to guide these lands with Bran's counsel, but the lords grow bolder. Bran, let's just say his gifts don't necessarily make him a master of politics. He sees things we cannot, but he's distant. I'm not sure if that's by choice or by nature. The realm is fracturing faster than we can mend it." He paused, watching Jon's reaction carefully. "You are the one man left who might unify us. Not with fear, not with dragonfire, but with your reputation for compassion and honor." Jon shook his head, every muscle tense. "Unify us, how? By wearing a crown and sitting on a throne forged of melted swords? I've had enough of that. Even my father, Ned Stark, was executed by a king. My true father, Rhaegar Targaryen, died in pursuit of a dream that tore the realm apart. Daenerys wanted to break the wheel, but she lost herself. I refused to lose myself the way she did." Tyrion looked at him with sorrowful understanding. "The cost of leadership can be terrible, but if you truly believe in liberating the people, then you must consider what it means for them when you simply cast down tyrants and walk away. Another tyrant rises to take their place. Perhaps the only way to end this cycle is to offer a different sort of leadership. If you truly don't want to wear a crown, perhaps it's time we do away with crowns altogether." Jon regarded him with surprise. "A realm without kings or queens?" Tyrion shrugged. "Or at least, a realm where power rests with representatives chosen by the people. Mad, I know, but so was letting the lords choose the king, and we tried that once. If we can muster enough support among the small folk, perhaps we can install councils in each region, governed by local voices. It will be chaos at first, but it might be better chaos than we have now." Jon recalled Daenerys' promise to break the wheel, how it had curdled into tyranny. Yet Tyrion's words resonated with an echo of the free folk's way of life, where leaders emerged by respect, not birthright. A flicker of hope warmed Jon's chest. warring with the grim knowledge that those in power would never yield without a fight. The realm was splintered, and though he had brought down many petty kings, new ones would arise if nothing replaced their structure. He rested a hand on the hilt of Longclaw, feeling the worn leather. "The realm needs peace," he said quietly. "If I can help bring that about, I will. But I will never call myself king." Tyrion nodded slowly. "Then let's not speak of thrones anymore. We speak only of liberation, and of a new realm governed by councils. But to get there, we need to end the warlords. We need to convince or defeat them. And that, my friend, may be the hardest battle of all." So it began, an unlikely coalition between Jon Snow, reluctant Liberator, and Tyrion Lannister, weary hand to a king who seldom wore his crown. They rallied support from every corner of King's Landing that still held a spark of hope. They sent ravens to the Vale, the Reach, the Stormlands, and Dorne, urging them to consider peaceful assemblies rather than royal decrees. Some scoffed at the idea, calling it treasonous. Others expressed cautious interest, especially in lands tired of petty rulers. But the tide would not turn overnight. Word came that 3 warlords in the Crownlands prepared to converge on the city, seeking to destroy the notion of a council and plant their own royal banners in the Red Keep's ruins. Jon found himself once more at the head of an army, this time a coalition of Northmen loyal to Sansa's alliances, free folk who followed him out of respect, exiled knights yearning for redemption, and small folk militias who bore pitchforks and homemade spears. The defenders of King's Landing encompassed every station of life, from ex-thieves to former gold cloaks, now fighting side by side under Jon's banner. They called themselves the Liberators, though Jon flinched whenever he heard the word. It suggested a grand mission, almost holy in nature. He felt unworthy of such a title, haunted by the memory of all the blood on his hands. The warlords arrived with standard armies, rows of disciplined infantry, cavalry with polished lances, minor lords in gleaming armor. They expected a straightforward battle. What they found was a city that refused to be subdued, defended by a chaotic legion of men and women who fought as though they had nothing to lose. Jon orchestrated a defensive strategy that lured the cavalry into narrow streets, where stones and boiling oil rained down from rooftops. Pike formations at the city gates held firm against repeated charges. Arrows blackened the sky, launched from hidden vantage points along the walls. In the swirl of clashing steel and anguished cries, the Liberators fought with a passion that could not be matched by armies led only by ambition. Jon commanded from the front lines, never from a distant perch. He felt the old rush of adrenaline, the primal drive that once carried him through the long night. As war raged, he glimpsed a future beyond the violence. A land where no single monarch ruled, where power dispersed like tributaries of a great river, feeding the soil of the realm. He tried to hold onto that vision, to let it guide his sword arm. For if all he brought was more slaughter, then how was he any different from those he overthrew? The clash lasted from dawn until the fading light of sunset. In the end, the warlords' armies broke, their lines scattered. Some fled, others surrendered. 2 of the warlords were captured alive, cowering in the wreckage near the city gates. They expected execution, but Jon demanded they stand trial before the people they had terrorized. It was the first of such public trials. Common folk gathered to witness the downfall of their supposed rulers, and a rough council of local representatives questioned the warlords. Their crimes spilled out: extortion, torture, child conscription. The verdict was swift: execution by the people's hand, though Jon turned his face away when the sentence was carried out. He heard their screams, but steeled himself. He told himself that each cut was severing the roots of tyranny, forging a new path for Westeros. The city exhaled a collective sigh, relieved yet bloodied. In the wake of that victory, Tyrion convened what he called the First Council of the Freed, drawing together men and women from all walks of life: merchants, blacksmiths, farmers, soldiers, maesters, even a few septons, though the faith was in disarray. They gathered in the Dragon Pit, that old ruin on the hill, choosing it as a symbolic site to show that no dragon, and no king, would overshadow their assembly. Jon stood before them, not as a king but as a guide, encouraging them to speak for their communities. At first, it was chaos. Shouting matches, accusations, demands for vengeance. But gradually, some semblance of structure emerged. They appointed speakers, took turns airing grievances, and even drafted a rough set of bylaws. Jon watched with cautious optimism, seeing in their efforts a fragile seed that might grow into a new form of governance. Still, the realm was vast, and chaos continued to reign in many parts. Reports arrived of fresh uprisings in the Reach, where a new claimant to Highgarden styled himself King of the Fields. The Stormlands faced an internal power struggle after Gendry Baratheon vanished, presumed dead or captured. In the Vale, rumors swirled of a fanatical knight who had crowned himself the true Falcon. And Dorne remained silent, suspicious of any outside influence. Jon realized that if this council was to have any real effect, they needed allies across Westeros who believed in a future without absolute monarchs. The work of liberation was far from done. So he rode out again, leaving a small garrison to protect King's Landing and defend the nascent council. This time, he traveled with a more substantial host. Not an army of conquest, but a force meant to persuade where it could and fight where it must. The sigils were varied. The dire wolf of Stark, the red fist of the free folk, the broken wheel that some had adopted as a new symbol of their cause. The roads were still dangerous. Brigands prowled for easy prey, and Jon's company clashed with them in skirmishes that left the ditches littered with corpses. In each town they passed, they held gatherings, inviting the people to choose delegates who could travel to King's Landing and join the council. The response was mixed. Some were skeptical, fearing it was just another ploy by a would-be king. Others embraced it eagerly, their desperation outweighing their caution. In the dusty squares of the Reach, near what remained of Highgarden's splendor, Jon encountered a lord calling himself Garland Tyrell, though the line of Tyrell was believed extinguished. This Garland claimed to be a bastard son of Loras Tyrell, though the dates and facts were dubious at best. Still, he had a sizable following, promising to restore the glory of the Reach under a noble monarchy. Jon, accompanied by Tormund and a delegation of local farmers, approached this self-proclaimed lord in a parley. The man sat on a wooden throne in a rose garden that struggled to bloom in the aftermath of war. His knights flanked him, shining armor under the glare of the midday sun. Jon laid out the council's vision. No more crowns, no more single rulers, power resting in the hands of representatives from each region. Garland sneered, dismissing it as a fool's dream. The common folk lack the capacity to rule. They need guidance, a firm hand. The Tyrells always provided prosperity for the Reach, and I intend to restore that tradition. The small folk are content as long as their bellies are full and their fields are green. Jon felt anger stir. They deserve more than a full belly. They deserve a say in how they're governed. Your so-called tradition led to endless power struggles. Must we repeat history? Garland laughed. History is built on strong houses and rightful kings. Who better than a Tyrell to lead the Reach? The parley ended in a tense stalemate. Jon resolved to show the small folk they had an alternative. He and his companions roamed the villages, encouraging them to send delegates to the council. Garland responded by sending armed men to threaten and intimidate. Skirmishes flared. Yet the more Garland tried to clamp down, the more the people grew discontent with him. It culminated in a confrontation on the fields outside Highgarden, where Jon's forces, bolstered by volunteers who rose up against the pretender lord, engaged Garland's knights. The battle was relatively short. Many knights refused to shed blood for an uncertain claim and surrendered. Garland tried to flee, but was captured by a mob of peasants who dragged him before Jon. Once more, the cycle played out. A tyrant faced the judgment of the people he sought to dominate. This time, Jon pressed for leniency, suggesting imprisonment rather than execution, hoping to break the endless chain of violence. With reluctance, the newly formed local council agreed, and Garland was locked away in the dungeons of Highgarden. The seat was then managed by a provisional council of farmers, merchants, and knights of lesser houses willing to cooperate. It was imperfect and messy, but it was better than another self-crowned monarch. As Jon traveled onward, the pattern repeated itself like a grim refrain. In the Stormlands, he found Gendry Baratheon imprisoned by a rogue banner lord who wanted to claim the Storm's end seat. Jon's party freed Gendry, who had never asked to be a king but wanted to restore order in the Stormlands. Gendry, to Jon's relief, listened to the idea of a council-based governance. "I was a bastard blacksmith," Gendry said. "The small folk are my people. If they want a say, let them have it." The local lords were wary, but the battered small folk saw promise in Gendry's humility. The seeds of councils took root there as well. In the Vale, Jon encountered a more stubborn resistance. The Vale lords were proud, and the self-proclaimed True Falcon, a knight named Ser Emyn Corbray, mustered a formidable force. He believed the Vale had no need to bow to rabble councils, proclaiming that only a noble hawk could watch over the high crags. The mountainous terrain made assaults difficult, but Jon had the advantage of the airy small folk, who resented the constant demands of the knight's regime. Stealth raids, orchestrated by the free folk's uncanny climbing abilities, disrupted supply lines. Within weeks, Ser Emyn's men grew desperate. Jon offered terms of peace if they surrendered, but Ser Emyn tried a final, suicidal stand at the gates of the moon. The fighting was fierce, with men falling over the high cliffs to their deaths. By the end of it, the True Falcon lay dying at Jon's feet, his armor dented, blood pooling. "You're no king," he spat with his last breath. "Who are you to judge me?" Jon felt a hollow ache in his chest, crouching beside the dying man. "I'm no one," he whispered, shaking his head. "I only want these people free." Ser Emyn died with confusion etched on his face, perhaps unable to fathom the notion of a man fighting for a cause other than personal power. The Vale lords, now leaderless, grudgingly opened talks with Jon's expanding Council of the Freed. Months passed, and the shape of Westeros began to shift. Dorne remained aloof, though rumors suggested they were curious about the councils forming in the other regions. Sansa in the north sent her own delegates, affirming that the North remained independent but willing to support any system that offered peace. Bran had all but withdrawn into his own mind, rarely seen by the people. Tyrion stayed in King's Landing, tending the fragile seed of representative governance. Bit by bit, the petty monarchs fell, either defeated by Jon's armies or convinced to join the new order once they saw how the winds were blowing. The lords who once swore oaths to mad kings or incompetent kings now found themselves negotiating with blacksmiths, farmers, and scholars. It was a revolution unlike any Westeros had seen in living memory. And through it all, Jon Snow grew ever more weary. Each victory came at a cost. Each new skirmish, each clash with a would-be tyrant, tore more lives apart. He slept fitfully, haunted by the ghosts of those he had killed and those he couldn't save. When he closed his eyes, he sometimes saw Daenerys, her silver hair stained with blood, whispering, "This was my dream, but you took it from me." He would wake, sweat-soaked, heart-pounding, feeling the inevitability of what he had done. Perhaps he was truly cursed to bring down monarchs, even one he had loved, all in the name of liberation. Yet the realm slowly stabilized. Regional councils formed, sending delegates to a central assembly in King's Landing. They argued bitterly, clashed over old grudges, but for the first time in centuries, they had a forum to resolve disputes without war. Jon stood apart from their gatherings more and more, content to let them handle their own affairs. He had never wanted to rule, and if the council succeeded, his role might finally be finished. People hailed him as Aegon the Liberator, but he insisted they drop that name. He was Jon Snow, he would say, just Jon Snow. Some listened, others clung to the legend. One day, after yet another victory feast in King's Landing that Jon found tedious, he slipped away to the courtyard of the Red Keep's remnants. A gentle breeze tugged at his cloak. He gazed upon the rubble where the Iron Throne once stood. Only twisted metal remained, partially melted, partially torn away by years of neglect. It struck him that the emblem of absolute power had literally been reduced to scrap. Footsteps approached from behind, and he turned to see Tyrion, looking thoughtful. "Strange to stand here, isn't it?" Tyrion asked softly, So much blood spilled for that throne, and now nobody sits upon it. Jon nodded. That's the world we fought for, one without a single seat of power. But is it enough? Tyrion regarded the battered relic. I've come to learn that nothing in politics is ever enough. People will always disagree, fight, scheme, but they'll do so in a system that doesn't rest on one person's head. That Jon Snow might be the best we can hope for. Jon looked away, remembering the boy he once was, the cast-off bastard who dreamed of honor. If only that boy could see him now, scarred by wars, haunted by a prophecy he never wanted. I hope it lasts. Tyrion smiled sadly. I'd say if you truly want it to last, stay. Help us guide it. Jon drew in a slow breath. I've guided enough, fought enough, killed enough. The councils can manage without me. They should manage without me. If this new world depends on one man, it's no different from a monarchy. Tyrion studied him. Where will you go? Jon's gaze fell on the broken remains of the throne. North, I suppose. Beyond the wall or to Winterfell. I don't know. Just away. Tyrion's expression softened. You've done so much, sacrificed so much. If anyone deserves rest, it's you. But know that you'll always have a place here, should you ever wish to return. Jon offered a faint smile. Thank you. Truly. He placed a hand on Tyrion's shoulder. You've done the realm a great service, Tyrion. More than they'll ever know. The next day, with minimal fanfare, Jon gathered Ghost, Tormund, and the remaining free folk who yearned for the quieter life beyond the politics of the South. He left King's Landing without parades or cheering crowds, disappearing into the rolling hills and winding roads that led north. Along the way, villagers recognized him, offering thanks or calling him the Liberator. He accepted their gratitude with humble nods, refusing invitations to feast in his honor. In truth, part of him still felt unworthy. He had broken too many oaths, shed too much blood. He had overthrown monarchs from the bastard of Bolton to the mother of dragons herself, all in the name of freeing the realm. To the people, he was a hero. To himself, he remained a man who had done what needed doing, no matter the heartbreak. Crossing the neck, he passed through Winterfell. Sansa embraced him warmly, though her eyes shone with tears. She had heard the stories of how he had toppled the petty kings who rose in the wake of Daenerys' death, of how councils sprouted in place of thrones, and she marveled at the audacity. She sensed the weariness in her half-brother, her cousin truly, and urged him to stay for a time. Jon lingered for a few days, reminiscing on old memories and watching as the North thrived under Sansa's measured rule. The scars of war healed slowly, but winter was receding, giving way to a gentler spring. He felt a pang of longing. Here was home, but it was also a reminder of all he had lost. After bidding Sansa farewell, he ventured farther north, through the gates of Castle Black. The remaining brothers of the Night's Watch received him with something akin to reverence, though their numbers were few. Some recalled him as the Lord Commander who had defied death. He spent a single night in his old quarters, unable to sleep, too many ghosts in those corridors. By dawn, he took Ghost's lead and walked through the ancient gate in the wall, heading into the lands of eternal snow. There, in the vast wilderness, he hoped to find peace. The free folk traveled in small clans, scattering across the tundra in search of fresh hunting grounds. Jon found a secluded patch of forest near a glimmering frozen lake, where he built a modest cabin with the help of Tormund and a few others who decided to remain close. The days rolled by, quiet except for the howling wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. Jon hunted, fished, tended a small hearth. Sometimes he would climb a nearby ridge and gaze south, remembering the fields of battle, the roar of dragons, the thunderous calls of men who named him king. More often, he thought of those he had loved and lost, Ed, Ygritte, Daenerys. Their memories drifted through his mind like snowflakes, each one distinct and gone too soon. Seasons passed. Rumors reached him now and then. The councils in the south still met, forging laws and alliances, though arguments were frequent. Tyrion remained a central figure, advocating reason and compromise. The region lords learned to negotiate. There were still skirmishes, still tensions, but no one man or woman held the realm in iron chains. It was a flawed peace, but it was freer than anything Westeros had known in centuries. Sometimes, Jon heard travelers speak his name in awe, weaving legends about the Wolf King who overthrew tyrants, from Bolton to Targaryen to a dozen petty lords. They said he was Azor Ahai reborn, the champion of the Lord of Light, or the chosen of the old gods. He dismissed such talk, his breath misting in the northern cold. Yet on winter nights, as he sat by the flickering fire in his cabin, he felt the heavy hand of fate upon him. He had been shaped by dire circumstances to become a liberator, to overthrow monarchs and free the realm from their grip. Was that his destiny, or a role he had chosen step by step, guided by compassion and necessity? He might never know, but he did know that the realm, for once, breathed without the suffocating weight of a single crown. That was enough. If the gods had chosen him, or if chance and circumstance had formed him, he could accept it. He had done what was needed. Now he would rest. In the biting cold, surrounded by the silence of ancient trees, Jon Snow closed his eyes. The memories of battles, betrayals, and heartbreak drifted around him like ghosts. He could almost feel the warmth of Daenerys' hand, the gentle hush of her voice echoing from another life, promising to break the wheel. He had helped finish what she started, though not in the way she intended. In the end, he realized perhaps that was always his destiny, to bring down those who thought themselves above the people, to show that a better world could be shaped by many hands, not just one. It was a burden that had weighed on him for years, but now it felt lighter, as though the responsibility was shared by thousands across Westeros. A faint hush of wind swept across the frozen lake, rattling the bare branches. Ghost stirred at his side, ears perked. Jon breathed in the frigid air. In his heart, he felt a mixture of sorrow and hope. The realm was free from crowns, and he was free from the realm. His watch had been long and grueling, but it was over. A new dawn was breaking, somewhere far away, over the councils and fields of a land learning to govern itself. Jon Snow had been the blade that cut down tyranny, the shield that protected the innocent, the reluctant heir who refused to rule. He had given everything, including his love, to bring Westeros to this fragile peace. At last, he could let the quiet winter night envelop him, content in the knowledge that he had fulfilled his unwanted destiny, overthrowing monarchs, freeing the realm, and allowing the living to forge their own future, unfettered by the chains of a single, all-consuming throne. Jon Snow woke to the distant crack of ice shifting beneath the morning sun. Outside his small cabin, the frozen lake shimmered under dawn's pale light, and a fine veil of frost clung to the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees. He inhaled the crisp air, feeling it burn his lungs. This was a clean cold, untainted by the stench of battlefields and despair that haunted so many of his memories. Here, in the far north, time felt slow, measured by the growth of snowdrifts rather than the frantic calls of trumpets and the pound of horses' hooves. He swung his legs off the rough-hewn cot, noticing Ghost curled near the door. The direwolf lifted his head, ears pricked, and Jon reached out to scratch behind them. He was grateful for Ghost's silent company, for Tormund's boisterous presence in the nearby settlement of free folk, and for the relative solitude that had allowed him to ease the burden of constant war. Outside, the world was still. A faint wind pulled at his fur cloak. He scanned the edge of the forest, thinking of the path that lay somewhere beyond the lake, the path that would lead south to the wall and then farther to the realm he had fought so hard to change. For the better part of 2 years, he couldn't say precisely how long, he had kept to these quiet wilds. The councils in the south, guided by Tyrion and others, were forging a new form of governance. A realm without kings, they called it, or at least one where power was shared among councils instead of concentrated in one crowned head. Word of their progress had reached Jon in fragments, brought by the few wanderers bold enough to venture north. Each time he heard of some crisis or disagreement among the representatives, he felt that tug of responsibility. But each time, he reminded himself that Westeros needed to learn to stand on its own. He had paid his debts in blood, and the realm was no longer shackled to a single throne. Yet he was still haunted by the faces of those who had perished to bring about that fragile peace. He could almost see them sometimes, in the flicker of the fire or the twist of wind-blown snow. Ned Stark's solemn visage, Daenerys Targaryen's fierce eyes, the courageous grin of his brother Robb. Even the memory of Ramsay Bolton's smug sneer surfaced in those quiet moments, reminding Jon that evil seldom died in a single stroke. He had once believed, in more youthful days, that the world's villains could be vanquished like the others at the point of a blade. But men's hearts were complicated, and tyranny had many faces. Despite all that, he had done what needed doing. Overthrown a queen he once loved, shattered the rule of would-be monarchs, ushered in councils across Westeros. If destiny was real, then perhaps that was his place in the tapestry of fate, an unwanted champion who carved a new shape for the realm. He gathered himself that morning with no clear intentions other than to hunt a bit farther from the cabin. Supplies were running low, and he preferred smoked venison or hare to the thin fish he often pulled from the lake. With Ghost padding silently at his side, Jon began trekking into the forest, passing between tall pines whose boughs drooped under the weight of snow. The footsteps of man and direwolf left a trail of prints in the powder. He inhaled deeply and let the forest's hush fill his senses. Perhaps he should have been content. This was, after all, a life free from the demands of lords and the horror of the battlefield. Now he could breathe, yet peace never lingered long for him. As he tracked deer prints and listened for the rustle of prey in the undergrowth, he noticed something else. A hush deeper than the usual northern silence. It was as though the woods themselves held their breath. Ghost's ears stiffened, his hackles slightly raised. Jon put a hand on Longclaw's hilt, though he had yet to see any sign of danger. The free folk insisted that nothing remained in these woods more threatening than the occasional bear or passing shadowcat, now that the others were gone. But a prickle at the back of Jon's neck suggested otherwise. He moved slowly, scanning between the trunks. Several moments passed in tense quiet. Then he heard it, the soft crunch of snow under a foot that did not belong to him or Ghost. He froze, turning his head. Ghost let out a low growl. Before Jon could call out, a figure emerged from behind a pine. They wore a thick cloak of white fur that blended with the surroundings, and for an instant Jon thought it might be one of the free folk. Then the figure pulled back their hood, revealing a woman with skin weathered by wind, her eyes dark and keen. She carried a short spear, and her face bore tribal tattoos that Jon did not recognize. She met Jon's gaze without fear. "I'd wondered if I'd find you." Jon felt his pulse quicken. It wasn't uncommon for smaller clans of the free folk to wander these areas, but her tattoos and accent suggested she came from tribes even farther north than those he knew. He kept his sword sheathed, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. "Who are you?" "Shalora," she answered. "I've walked a long way, guided by rumors and the counsel of my seers. We have heard tales of a man who once rose from death, who carried the fire of life within him." Jon stiffened, memories of the Red Woman's voice echoing in his mind. He tried to keep his tone steady. "I'm no one's chosen. If that's what you're after, you've wasted your steps." She studied him a moment, her gaze unflinching. "There's something to the old powers, Crow King, or so my elders say. They claim you were touched by the dark and pulled back by the light. Such men are rare." She paused, turning her eyes to Ghost, who stared at her with silent wariness. "I come to warn you. There are stirrings among the tribes beyond the ice rivers. Whispers of a new gathering, a new power. We've heard your name and we've heard the songs. We suspect it concerns you, whether you wish it or not." Jon let out a slow breath. He had hoped that whatever old magic lurked in the far north had slipped back into the shadows after the Night King was destroyed. But if these people believed something stirred, it might be worth hearing them out. "What kind of power?" Shalora's brows drew together. "Our spirits do not name it yet, only that it is old and hungry, something seeking to fill the void left by the great other's defeat. Some say a restless force moves across the ice, calling forth wraiths that have nothing to do with the White Walkers you knew. We are not certain, but my tribe saw omens, and we decided to send me south to find you. the one who overcame death. Jon's heart sank. He had always been taught that once the White Walkers were gone, their threat ended for good. The children of the forest, the men of the Watch, even Bran's visions had hinted that the darkness would retreat with the Night King's demise. Yet the world was vast, full of ancient powers that had never cared about men's beliefs or assumptions. If this is true, you believe I can stop it? She exhaled, a wisp of vapor curling around her face in the frigid air. I don't know. I only know our elders spoke of you as a guardian, that your blood is touched by ice and fire. We have no illusions about the old tales, but we cannot ignore them. Jon exchanged a glance with Ghost. This was the last thing he wanted, another grand threat, another prophecy. He had come north to escape precisely that. But if some unknown menace was rising, he could hardly ignore it. Thousands of people dwelled in those wastes, from the free folk to the scattered tribes that lived an even harsher life than the wildlings. I'll need to speak with Tormund, gather more information. If your tribe is threatened, we can see what might be done. Shalora inclined her head in quiet gratitude. My elders will want word of how you plan to proceed. May I stay in your lands and wait for your decision? Jon nodded. There's a settlement a day's walk west of here. Tormund Giantsbane can make arrangements for you. I'll be there soon. She studied him a moment longer, as though appraising the shape of his destiny, then turned away. Her form melted back into the trees, and Ghost watched her vanish with an uneasy whine. Jon remained still for a long while, staring after her footprints in the snow. He had felt certain that, once the White Walkers were gone, the greatest dangers of the North had faded to mere rumors. Yet if Shalora was right, something new, and perhaps even older, might be prowling beyond the ice rivers. The thought weighed on him like a fresh chain around his chest. He sighed, whispering to Ghost, "We can't even find peace in these frozen wastes, can we?" The direwolf blinked in silent agreement. Jon abandoned his hunt, deciding that smoked fish would suffice for another day, and returned to the cabin. He gathered his gear, bow, sword, spare leathers. There was no telling what he might need if he ventured far. After a quick meal of dried venison, he set out for Tormund's settlement, trudging across the frozen lake and through thickets of evergreen. The journey took the better part of the day, but as dusk settled, he saw thin spirals of smoke rising above the treetops. From a slight ridge, he looked down on the gathering of free folk huts clustered around a central fire pit, their roofs covered with moss and packed snow. A few watchers recognized him at once, waving from their posts. He descended with Ghost at his side, hearing the familiar din of chatter, the soft laughter of children playing among the huts, the clatter of cooking pots as someone prepared a communal meal. "Jon!" a booming voice called. Tormund Giantsbane appeared, as large and wild-bearded as ever, stomping across the snow. He clapped Jon on the back in greeting. "I saw Shalora pass through earlier. Odd woman. Said she was looking for you." Jon inclined his head. "So we've met." She spoke of a threat rising beyond the ice rivers. Some new power calling to the dead. Tormund's thick red brows furrowed. She mentioned it, very vague, but it gave me a chill. Like the time my father told me stories of snow wraiths in the old days. Jon rubbed a hand over his face. "I can't ignore it, Tormund. If these tribes are in danger, they'll either try to flee south or fight alone. Either way, it might tear apart what peace we have up here. Maybe worse." Tormund nodded gravely. "You're thinking we need to add north again. See what's stirring." A reluctant exhale escaped Jon's lips. "Yes, I don't want to lead another war. But if something's happening, better to face it head-on before it grows too large to contain." He paused, letting the faint warmth of a cooking fire seep into his skin. "We'll form a scouting party. Small, quiet. If Shalora's tribe is nearby, we'll speak to them." Tormund gave a grim smile. "You know me. I'm always ready for a march, especially if it means protecting our people." He gestured at the huts. "But we have families here, children. We can't just leave them unguarded." Jon looked around, nodding. "I won't ask everyone to come. Maybe just a handful of volunteers, men and women used to traveling light. The rest can strengthen the settlement, Keep watch for any sign of trouble." Tormund scratched his beard. "And what if the trouble is bigger than us? What if it's worse than a few stray wraiths?" Jon's memory flashed to the endless tide of wights they'd once fought, the shriek of the Night King's undead dragon. The notion that something equally terrible might be rising made his stomach twist. "Then we'll return and warn everyone, and possibly even call for help from the south." Tormund snorted. "You really think those Southerners are keen to join another war in the far north? After they've spent years rebuilding?" Jon's mind flicked to Tyrion, to Sansa, to the fragile network of councils. He sighed. "I don't know. But if there's a threat that could spill south, it's better they learn about it early. Even if they're reluctant, we can't leave them ignorant." Tormund gave a grunt of agreement. "So be it. We'll do what we must." They spoke to Shalora that evening around a low-burning fire, the three of them huddled against the cold night air. She recounted what she knew. Her tribe, the Frost Moon, inhabited the edges of a region that few free folk ever ventured into, far beyond the Frostfangs, where the glaciers rose like mountains of ice. Recently, hunters had gone missing. Strange lights were seen flickering across the white plains, and one of their spiritual elders claimed to have seen shapes moving beneath the ice as though something was stirring in watery caverns below. They'd also found an abandoned camp that looked like it had been overrun by something. The tents were shredded, the snow stained red. No footprints led away, as if the culprits had vanished into thin air. Jon tried to keep his face calm, but he felt a queasy sense of recognition. The mysteries of the far north always bordered on the supernatural. The White Walkers had once been a myth to most. Who was to say there were no other horrors hidden in that endless expanse? Though it sounded different from the Whites, it was no less unsettling. A handful of free folk volunteered to accompany them, including a tall woman named Bara who was renowned for her skill with a bow, and a wiry man named Lod who claimed he could move across ice without a whisper of sound. Together, they formed a scouting party of 8, counting Jon, Tormund, and Shalora. As dawn approached, they shared provisions, said farewells to friends and loved ones, and set forth into the unforgiving wilderness. Days blended into one another as they traveled north, forging a path through deepening snowdrifts. The wind cut at their faces like knives, and each night they huddled around fires that crackled and spat in the frosty air. Shalora led them on routes seldom used by the free folk, pointing out landmarks that barely looked like anything more than lumps of ice or ridges of rock. Now and again, they saw tufts of lichen or patches of hardy moss clinging to stone, but for the most part, the land was a stark palette of white and pale blue. Ghost prowled on the flanks, occasionally disappearing into the swirling snow. Jon walked in the center, hands gloved, hood pulled tight around his face, scanning the horizon. He had marched north many times in his life, as a ranger of the Night's Watch, as a would-be ally to the free folk. Each time, the land had seemed immeasurably vast, a place where humanity's presence was a meager scratch on the surface. This time was no different. On the 4th night, they spotted the first sign of another human presence. Smoke rising in the distance, faint against a dreary sky. Shalora guided them toward it. As they drew nearer, the smell reached them, rancid, like burnt hair. When they finally arrived, they found a campsite in ruins. Blackened posts jutted from heaps of snow, and charred hide lay scattered in ragged shapes. Something had gutted the tents and set them aflame. Corpses, half buried in drifts, showed the savage work that had been done. Jon knelt by a body, carefully brushing aside the snow to reveal a face twisted in agony. It looked like a free folk hunter, perhaps from a tribe unknown to him. The chest was torn open, the eyes wide with terror. No footprints remained besides the ones the scouting party left behind. Fresh snowfall had covered any tracks. But there was a strange pattern in the ashes, like something had been dragged in circles around the camp. Bara inhaled sharply, pointing to a cluster of stones covered in red markings. "Look there." She crouched by the stones, which stood about knee-high, each carved with symbols foreign to Jon's eyes. The paint, or perhaps blood, used for those markings was partially frozen, glinting darkly in the firelight of their torches. The patterns reminded John of the runes he'd seen in the caves where the children of the forest once lived. Spirals and curving lines. But these were different. Cruder, somehow, as though drawn hastily or frantically. Shalora's face paled. "This is not from my tribe. We have no custom of carving runes like these. Nor do any tribes I know. Could this be the work of the children?" She sounded uncertain. John shook his head, remembering the delicacy of the children's ancient carvings, how they told stories of the long night. "No," he murmured. "They carved images far older and more refined. This looks more like a ward or a summoning." He swallowed hard, recalling faint stories from old Nan, half forgotten around the Winterfell hearth. Some of the old gods were said to be vengeful or twisted by the cold. Could it be worshippers? But who would do such a thing? He looked again at the body, then around at the circle of scorch marks. It's as if they attacked, killed everyone, and performed some ritual. For what purpose? Tormund's voice was gruff with disgust. Madness, perhaps. Or maybe they're worshipping something that demands blood and fire. He towed the blackened remains of a tent. Reminds me of the folktales about shape-changers who sacrificed men to gain powers of the cold. Just stories, I always thought. Shalora's expression grew grim. My tribe said the same about the White Walkers once, long ago. We were wrong then, too. A deep hush settled over them. John realized how little they truly knew of these northern expanses. The Night King had been a horror that threatened all life, but that didn't guarantee there weren't other evils hidden beyond the edge of the maps. Carefully, they dug shallow graves in the snow, placing rocks as best they could around the dead. It was a meager gesture, but they couldn't leave them strewn about for scavengers. Afterward, they made camp a short distance from the ruins, building a large fire and posting double watches. The wind howled through the night, rattling their tents. John hardly slept, troubled by thoughts of what might lurk in the blizzard. The next morning, they pressed on. They soon realized that each new league brought them deeper into unknown territory. Even Tormund, who prided himself on having roamed the entire north, admitted he had never ventured so far. Shalora guided them by her tribe's landmarks. Huge pillars of ice that jutted from frozen seas, gullies carved by ancient glaciers, cliffs that loomed like petrified giants. On the 8th day, they found Shalora's people, the Frost Moon, camped near a craggy ridge. The tribe numbered around 50 souls. Men, women, and children who lived in hide tents reinforced with animal bones. The moment they saw Shalora return, they rushed to meet her with relief. John felt their eyes on him, curious, wary. A tall man with thick gray streaks in his hair stepped forward, leaning on a carved staff. His shoulders bore a mantle of white wolf fur, and his gaze was sharp as he looked at John. "Elder Harrick," Shalora said, bowing her head. "I have found the Crow King. He has come." Harrick regarded John a moment. "I see him. He is both older and younger than I expected." The man's face cracked into what might have been a slight smile. "We owe you gratitude, Crow King, for your bravery in coming so far." John bowed his head. "I'm no king, Elder. I came because Shalora told me your tribe is threatened. We saw evidence of something violent near a burned campsite." A chorus of worried murmurs spread among the assembled tribesfolk. Harrick rapped his staff once on the ground to quiet them. "Yes, we have seen it too. We call them the Mist Wraiths for now, though we know not if they are truly wraiths or men with dark powers. They appear in storms, they chant words none of us recognize, and they leave ruin behind." Tormund folded his arms. "How many times have they attacked?" Harrick's eyes flickered. "We have had 3 attacks so far on scattered hunting parties. The Frost Moon tribe has retreated here, to the shelter of these cliffs. But we cannot stay forever. Our supplies dwindle. We risk starvation if we do not hunt. At night, we see lights flickering in the distance, as though they are performing more rituals." A hushed fear hung over the gathered men and women. John felt the weight of their gaze, a desperate hope that he might produce some miracle solution. He exhaled a cloud of fog. "We are few. We didn't come with an army. but we can help protect your tribe or at least figure out what these people, if they are people, want. Have they attempted to speak with you? Shalora answered. No. They appear amid the snow, kill, burn, and vanish. If they leave any living behind, it is only to spread fear. We tried sending an emissary to parley. He never returned. Jon clenched his jaw. It reminded him of the savage raids by the White Walkers at Hardhome. But these mist wraiths sounded different, more ritualistic. The runes, the circles of fire. Jon recalled the glimmer of those twisted markings. Has anyone gotten a clear look at them? He asked, scanning the crowd. An older woman stepped forward, a nasty scar across her cheek. I saw them from a distance. They wore heavy furs, but their faces were hidden behind masks of bone. One carried a staff topped by what looked like a skull. When the wind carried their voices, it was like scraping ice against stone. Jon exchanged a glance with Tormund, who scowled. Cultists, maybe? We had stories of certain wildling sects that worshipped dark spirits. But that's all they were, stories. Elder Herrick's voice was low. Stories can come true. Ours did when the White Walkers rose. We cannot simply dismiss this. Jon thought back to the look of that ruined camp, the swirl of strange runes. This was no mere band of raiders. Something guided them. Then we need to act. We should track them, or provoke them, see where they gather. Harrick gestured toward the distant horizon, where a jagged line of icebergs was just visible in the fading daylight. We have occasionally glimpsed their fires north of that ridge, near the old glacier fields. If you are determined, you might start there. The plan took shape quickly. Jon, Tormund, Shalora, Bara, and a few of the Frostmoon's best hunters would scout near the glacier fields, hoping to find the Mist Wraith's gathering place. The rest of the tribe would remain behind, guarded by Lod and a cadre of fighters. If the scouting party found a large encampment, they would return at once with the news so they could devise a strategy. Before setting off, Jon tried to reassure the tribe that no matter how dire things seemed, they were not alone. He felt a pang of déjà vu, recalling how he once promised the wildlings beyond the wall that he would stand with them against the White Walkers. That night, he slept fitfully in one of the Frostmoon tents, listening to the sigh of the wind over the ridges. The next morning, they left at first light. The glacier fields lay a long march away, requiring them to scale ice shelves and cross treacherous cracks where one misstep could send a person plummeting into a frigid crevasse. Progress was slow, and the cold seemed to intensify with every league. Ghost's white fur became nearly indistinguishable from the snow, and Jon had to keep an eye on the direwolf to avoid losing track of him. As evening fell on the second day of travel, they spotted a faint orange glow flickering beyond a tall ridge of ice. Everyone moved in hushed silence. Jon signaled for the group to spread out, approaching from different angles. The wind swirled, carrying the distant roar of some unseen storm. Tormund hefted his axe, his breath pluming around his face as he mouthed, "Ready!" Jon nodded and crept forward, pressing himself against an outcropping of ice. Carefully, he peered around it. They saw a shallow basin in the glacier, partially shielded by overhanging walls of ice. Within that basin, a circle of torches burned, planted in the snow. Dark shapes moved around them. Jon counted at least 15 figures, each draped in heavy furs, their faces hidden by horned or bestial masks. Some appeared carved from wood or bone, others shaped from what looked like shards of ice. In the center stood a taller figure holding a staff topped by a bleached skull with antlers. On the ground lay the limp form of what looked like a captive, possibly a Frostmoon hunter. The robed figure spoke in a guttural chant, words that sounded harsh and broken, occasionally punctuated by a keening cry from the others. Jon's blood pounded in his ears. It was indeed a ritual. He couldn't make sense of the language, but the malevolent intent was clear enough. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the tall figure plunged a jagged blade into the captive's chest. A shriek cut the air, echoing off the ice. Jon felt his stomach turn. Tormund cursed under his breath. Shalora's face contorted in anger. Without waiting for a signal, one of the Frostmoon hunters behind them loosed an arrow at the tall figure. The arrow flew true, catching the priest, or whatever it was, square in the side. The figure staggered, letting out a hiss that seemed both human and inhuman, then raised their staff. At once, the rest of the masked men whirled around, brandishing crude blades and short spears. A guttural roar filled the basin as they charged up the slope. "Fall back!" Jon barked, not wanting to be caught in open ground. But Tormund and the others had little choice. The masked figures were already surging forward, some bounding unnaturally fast across the snow, howling in savage fury. Steel clashed as two of the Frostmoon hunters braced themselves, spears forward, while Bara fired another arrow that took down one of the attackers. Jon raised Longclaw in time to parry a slash aimed at his face. The blow sent a shockwave up his arms. Whoever was behind that mask was strong. He gritted his teeth and countered, slicing through the attacker's furs and drawing a spurt of blood. A high-pitched shriek erupted, but the figure hardly slowed. Jon had to stab twice more before they collapsed in the snow. Tormund bellowed a war cry and swung his axe, cleaving a masked head clean off. More foes rushed him, stabbing with jagged weapons that screeched against his armor. Shalora moved with surprising agility, using her spear to knock aside an attacker's blow before planting it in their gut. The chaos of combat intensified, lit by the flickering glow of the torches below. Ghost lunged from the side, tearing at a masked man who tried to flank Jon. They were outnumbered, but the fury of the free folk was not to be underestimated. Arrows and spears found their marks, cutting down several of the cultists. Jon managed to glance toward the basin center, where the tall priest clutched at the arrow in their side. Blood stained the snow around their robes, yet somehow the figure still stood, chanting a low, guttural phrase while lifting the skull-topped staff. An eerie wind gusted through the basin, swirling flurries of snow so thick it became hard to see. Jon felt a strange pressure in the air, a sensation that prickled along his skin. Suddenly, the ground quaked beneath them, causing cracks to spiderweb across the ice. Jon nearly lost his footing. A chunk of the basin wall collapsed, sending shards of ice tumbling. He heard Tormund shout something indistinct. Through the swirling snow, Jon glimpsed shapes moving in the whiteness, too large to be the cultists. He blinked, straining to see, and realized with shock that two massive figures loomed in the gloom, their limbs strangely elongated and their skin pale as bone. They weren't giants. Jon had seen giants, and these were different. They seemed more sinuous, almost unnatural in the way their limbs bent. Their heads were topped with horns of ice. With unnatural grace, they bounded onto the battlefield, each step cracking the ice beneath them. A single blow from one of those creatures sent a Frostmoon hunter hurtling through the air. Another tore at the ground with taloned fingers, shrieking in an unearthly pitch. Jon's heart thundered. Had the priest summoned these abominations? He braced himself, mind racing. If they remained here, they'd be slaughtered or crushed when the ice gave way. "Retreat!" he shouted. "Back to the ridge." The free folk scrambled, fighting off the last of the cultists. Tormund tossed a wounded man over his shoulder, cursing as the tall creatures charged forward. Bara fired an arrow at one, but it barely seemed to notice, the shaft snapping against its unnaturally tough hide. Shalora darted ahead, guiding others to the crest of the slope. Jon stood near the rear, swinging Longclaw to keep the masked men at bay. He saw the priest raise the staff once more. A wave of cold slammed across the basin, so intense that Jon felt ice forming on his beard and eyelashes. It was like the chill of the White Walkers, yet different, more chaotic. He mustered his strength, determined not to let panic seize him. If they didn't move now, they'd all be trapped. With an effort, he hacked at another cultist and then turned to run. The tall creatures roared in the swirling snow, but the free folk managed to scramble back up the ridge, half blind in the fierce wind. Tormund hauled the wounded man, and Ghost stayed close to Jon's side. Once they reached the top, they ran, not daring to look back. The chanting and howls pursued them through the bitter cold, until at last they put enough distance and ridges between themselves and the basin to let them pause for breath. They crouched behind a jagged wall of ice, hearts pounding. The wind tore at their cloaks as though trying to yank them into oblivion. One of the Frostmoon hunters, an older man named Herad, was bleeding badly from a gash in his leg. Shalora knelt beside him, binding the wound with strips of cloth. They had lost at least 2 of their number in that desperate escape. Tormund shook his head in disbelief. What in all the hells were those tall fiends? Some new kind of giant? Bara's voice trembled with residual terror. No giant I've ever seen has a body that thin, and they came out of nowhere. She was cradling a bruise on her shoulder. I fired at one, it did nothing. Jon's breaths came in ragged gasps. It seems the priest summoned them, or woke them. We can't face them alone, not like this. Shalora's expression was grim. I've never heard of such creatures. This is darker magic than the walkers used, perhaps more primal. The air felt wrong when that staff was raised. Jon mulled over their options. They couldn't simply flee and leave the Frostmoon tribe to fend for themselves. Not when these cultists were gathering in numbers and possibly unleashing monstrous allies. But the handful of free folk warriors he had at his disposal stood little chance against such forces. We need more help, he said at last, swallowing the dread that rose in him. And not just from the tribes. We need the South. Tormund gave him a startled look. You mentioned it, but you really think they'll come? Swords from beyond the wall are one thing, but those councils and lords might be too busy squabbling. Jon set his jaw. They might not want to, but they also won't want another cataclysmic threat marching south. If we can convince Sansa, Tyrion, maybe others, that this is as dangerous as the White Walkers once were, they might rally. At least, they can send men, send supplies, or send word that the entire realm must unite again. Shalora helped Herad to his feet. We can guide you back to our tribe, but will you be able to cross the wall quickly? Time is short. Jon nodded, recalling the route he'd once taken. I know the paths. Castle Black is the quickest route. From there, it's a ride south. I'll go myself if I must. Tormund, you can remain behind, help organize the tribes so they can hold out a bit longer. We can't let these cultists expand unchecked. Tormund grimaced. You sure you want to face those southern folk again? You've tasted that life. Jon's voice was low. It's not about wanting. It's about needing. This threat is bigger than any tribe. And if the councils are truly meant to protect the people, they'll have to act. That was the whole point of the realm's transformation, wasn't it? So that no single throne could ignore a danger to its people. A shadow of old pain flickered across Tormund's eyes, but he nodded. So be it. I'll try to muster a defense. The Frostmoon can rally nearby clans. We might not hold out for long, but we'll do our best. They agreed on the plan. By the time they returned to the Frostmoon camp, the tribe was frantic with worry, hearing that more monstrous forces were involved. Jon convened with Elder Harrick, explaining they would need more time to gather a proper force. Harrick bowed his head in gratitude, though fear was plain on his face. We will endure if we can, he said, but the ancient chill grows. Our wise women have felt it in their dreams. Jon departed the next dawn, with Ghost at his side and only Shalora accompanying him. Tormund insisted he remain to organize the tribe's defenses, and Jon agreed. Bara stayed as well, determined to protect her people. Despite the risk, Shalora volunteered to guide Jon to Castle Black, for she was swift on her feet and knew enough paths to avoid roving cultists. Their journey south felt surreal after so many days venturing north. Now, each step carried them away from the unknown horrors, yet also closer to uncertain allies. Jon couldn't help thinking back to his earlier vow to remain out of southern politics. Fate was cruel indeed. The trek through the deep snows was harrowing, but after nearly a fortnight of careful travel, they spied the towering wall of ice in the distance. The sight made Jon's heart twist with nostalgia and dread. He remembered first seeing that colossal barrier as a boy, full of illusions about the honor and purpose of the Night's Watch. So much had changed since then. He had died, come back, toppled kings, and tried to lead a new life in the wilderness. Now he was returning to face new obligations. The gods, it seemed, had never been merciful to him. Night fell as they approached the wall's massive gates. The structure was less guarded than it once was. The Night's Watch was reduced to a skeleton force, its purpose nearly obsolete. Still, a handful of black-cloaked figures patrolled the top ramparts. When Jon hailed them in a strong voice, they shouted down, "Who goes there?" He stepped forward where their torches could reveal him, and a stunned silence followed. A younger brother recognized him at once, Jon Snow, the once Lord Commander, the living legend of the Night's Watch. They opened the gates. In the courtyard of Castle Black, shadows stretched across the old stone. A half-dozen men in black cloaks gathered around, uncertain whether to kneel or salute or simply stare. Jon dismounted from the borrowed horse he'd bartered for at a small free folk settlement days earlier. The horse whinnied, tired from the long journey. Shalora stood at his side, unwavering, scanning the fort with quiet fascination. A brother with a blonde beard stepped forward, face etched with awe. "My Lord Commander," he began, though Jon quickly lifted a hand. "I'm no longer your commander," Jon said, "but I need your help, and fast. There is a threat rising beyond the wall. Worse than what we saw with the White Walkers, potentially. I need to ride south, gather men and supplies." The men exchanged uncertain glances. One said, "We are few here, but we'll do what we can. You can take fresh horses from our stable, if that helps." Jon inclined his head. "Thank you. That will help." Shalora spoke up, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "I will stay the night here, if that is acceptable, and return north at first light. I must bring word to Tormund and the others. Jon, can you handle the southern realms alone?" Jon hesitated, but he knew time was precious. "I can. My family is in the north, and I have connections in King's Landing. If this realm is truly governed by councils, I'll go to them and plead the case. Then I'll return with whatever help I can muster." She clasped his arm, her face solemn. "May the spirits guide you, Crow King." Then she stepped back, letting the Watch brothers lead her to a warm place by the fire. Jon thanked her quietly, feeling a pang of guilt for handing so heavy a burden back to Tormund and the tribes. But he had no choice. If these cultists could not be met with a united front, the entire realm might suffer a calamity that would make even the war for the Dawn seem mild. He spent only a few hours at Castle Black, enough time to rest, gather provisions, and speak briefly with the handful of men still sworn to the Watch. Most of them were new recruits or older veterans who recalled him as a near-mythic figure. They offered him what meager help they could, though they were mostly Watchers in name only, waiting for an official word to disband or repurpose the Watch entirely. Jon thanked them and set out before dawn, riding a fresh horse through the gate that led into the Gift. Ghost ran alongside him, silent as ever. Crossing the Gift was a lonely journey, but easier than the trek beyond the wall. The snow was not as deep, the ground more forgiving. At lonely farmsteads, Jon noted signs of quiet rebuilding. Fences mended, new homes erected, children playing in the yard. The memory of the Gift during the long night was etched in his mind: desolation, fear, the dead rising in unimaginable numbers. Now the land seemed almost at peace. He wondered if it could remain so if the threat up north spilled down like an avalanche. He pressed on, sleeping only in short stretches, pushing the horse harder than he should have. Ghost never complained, he trotted tirelessly. By the time they reached the outskirts of Winterfell, several days had passed, and Jon felt the weariness in every muscle. The gates of Winterfell stood open, guarded by men wearing the stark sigil on their cloaks. One guard's eyes went wide at the sight of Jon. He let out a yelp of surprise and rushed to summon Lady Sansa. Jon rode into the courtyard, heart pounding with memories. The walls, the towers, the old stone, all so familiar. He dismounted, nearly buckling with exhaustion, as stable hands rushed to take the horse. Within minutes, Sansa appeared at the top of the steps, regal in her fur-lined gown, her red hair tucked beneath a warm hood. At first, she simply gazed at Jon, tears glimmering in her eyes. Then she hurried down the steps, arms outstretched. Jon moved to meet her, and they embraced tightly, neither speaking for a long moment. "Jon," she whispered at last, stepping back to look him over. "I feared you would never return south. What happened?" He swallowed, feeling a surge of relief at the sight of her, alive and well. "Sansa, I need your help," he said, voice low with urgency. "I'll explain everything, but first, can you call a council? The North's representatives, your key advisors. I need to tell them about a threat beyond the wall." Her face grew solemn at once. She had weathered many storms and recognized the dread in Jon's voice. "Yes, of course. Let's get you food and rest. Then we'll gather whoever we must." Inside, the warmth of Winterfell's great hall was both comforting and jarring after so many nights in the cold. Servants hurried to bring hot stew, bread, and mulled wine. Jon ate quickly, ignoring the curious stares from lords and ladies who passed by. Within the hour, Sansa had convened a small council in a private chamber. They included Lord Serwyn, Lady Mormont's nephew, since Lyanna had fallen in battle, and a few other northern nobles who'd risen to prominence under Sansa's rule. Though the North was technically independent of the southern councils, they maintained diplomacy. Jon stood at the head of the long table, Sansa by his side, as he recounted everything he had seen and heard. The strange cult, the monstrous creatures, the twisted rituals. He spoke of how the free folk were unprepared to face such a threat alone. When he finished, an uneasy hush enveloped the room. Lord Serwyn drummed his fingers on the table. "This is dire news indeed. But how can we be sure it will come south?" Jon met his gaze evenly. "We weren't sure the White Walkers would come south either, but they did. I saw monstrous creatures with my own eyes. If we don't act, and they swell in number, we risk another long night." One lady, tall and gray-haired, looked uneasy. "We've only just begun to recover from the wars. The North has enough troubles, food shortages in the western hills, tensions with the Ironborn raids along the coast. Can we afford to march an army beyond the wall again?" Sansa stepped in. "We can't afford not to if the threat is real. Jon Snow has never led us astray when it comes to dangers from the North." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "But perhaps we can call upon the southern councils as well. Their resources are broader. We stand stronger together." Jon sighed. "That is what I intend to do. I came here first because this is my home, and I hoped I could count on the North to at least hear me out. If the councils are reluctant, your support might sway them." The lords exchanged uncertain glances, but Sansa's face was set with quiet determination. She turned to Jon. "Whatever you decide in terms of traveling south, you have my blessing. I'll send a raven to King's Landing, summoning their delegates here, if that suits you. Or we can go to them. Which do you think is better?" Jon considered. "The journey from King's Landing is long, and I don't know how quickly their delegates can mobilize. We may not have that luxury. It might be faster if I go to them. If you can spare some men, we can travel together and show the councils this is serious." Sansa nodded. "Then that's what we shall do. Meanwhile, I'll start mustering the North's levies quietly. If we need to send troops, we'll be prepared." A sense of relief washed over Jon, tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. "Thank you," he said softly. "I only hope it's enough." In the following days, Sansa made the necessary arrangements. Ravens flew to lords across the North, alerting them that a new threat loomed, though the exact details were kept discreet to avoid panic. Jon spent those days recovering, but he also met with old friends and new lords, explaining what he had seen. He spoke with a few of the free folk who had chosen to settle in the Gift under the North's protection, hearing their warnings of how the tribes beyond the wall were scattered and frightened. Ghost wandered the familiar courtyards, drawing the stares of children who had never before seen a direwolf. Though a sense of homecoming warmed Jon's heart, he couldn't allow himself to grow attached. Duty pulled him onward. Finally, the day came to depart for King's Landing. He rode out of Winterfell at the head of a modest party. 30 riders, half of them knights who had pledged service to House Stark, half sworn swords of lesser houses. Sansa accompanied him for the first leg of the journey, but she would turn back at Moat Cailin, trusting Jon to carry the message forward. Before they parted, she took his hands. "Stay safe," she whispered. "We lost you once before. I can't bear to lose you again." Jon pressed her hands gently. "I will do my best. But if anything happens, remember the North must hold strong. That is our legacy." With that, they said their farewells. Jon continued south, riding beneath skies that slowly lost their icy gray hue as the climate grew milder. As the days passed, he noticed changes in the landscape. Fields of green, villages bustling with activity. The realm was gradually healing from the years of war. People were building new homes, planting fresh crops, forging alliances through the local councils. The roads were still rough, signs of old battles dotted the countryside, but there was a sense of fragile renewal. At an inn near the edge of the riverlands, Jon overheard talk of local councils meeting regularly to resolve disputes over grazing land and trade routes. He also heard rumors of bandits who resisted the new order, and of lords who bristled at the idea of ceding authority to commoners. Yet, by and large, the realm was not tearing itself apart as it once did when kings vied for the Iron Throne. Jon felt a flicker of hope. The system he and Tyrion had helped shape, born of necessity and the desire to avoid another tyrant, seemed to be holding, at least well enough to give people a chance at peace. But peace would be short-lived if the cult in the far north gained power. Anxiety gnawed at him whenever he recalled the monstrous forms rising from the snow. More than once, he awoke in the night, sweating from dreams of swirling frost and chanting voices, the tang of blood in the air. He forced himself onward. The journey was not swift, but at last, they reached the Crownlands. In the distance, King's Landing appeared, its walls partially rebuilt from the damage inflicted by Dragonfire years ago. The city's silhouette lacked some of its old grandeur, as many towers had not been fully restored, but it still bustled with life. Approaching the city gates, Jon felt a knot tighten in his chest. Memories flooded back, the last time he'd been here, after Daenerys' death. He had been a prisoner, then exiled to the Night's Watch for the crime of killing a queen. Now he returned of his own free will, no longer a prisoner, but burdened with a new mission. The guards let him pass once they recognized his name, though they regarded him with a mixture of awe and wariness. He was, after all, the man who had killed Daenerys Targaryen, the man rumored to be of Targaryen blood himself. But no crown adorned his head, and the only title he claimed was none at all. He made for the Red Keep or what remained of it. Beyond the scarring on the outer walls, the keep's courtyard was alive with the bustle of people going about the business of governance. Instead of a single monarch, various delegates milled about, wearing badges or garments that denoted their home regions. Some from the Reach, others from the Stormlands, and so on. This was the heart of the new council system. A constant Congress of Representatives meeting to debate and pass local edicts, as well as address realm-wide concerns. Finding Tyrion Lannister in that throng proved easier than Jon expected. He spotted a flash of silver hair, now nearly white, bobbing among a cluster of scribes near a low stone dais. When Tyrion caught sight of Jon, his eyes widened in genuine surprise. He murmured a quick word to the scribes, then approached. His face showed lines of age and fatigue, but a spark of the old cunning still lit his gaze. "Jon Snow," he said quietly, sounding both cautious and pleased. "I did not think you'd ever return to this place." Jon clasped the other man's arm. "Neither did I, but I have no choice. We need help, Tyrion. I bring urgent news from beyond the wall." Tyrion nodded gravely, motioning for Jon and his retinue to follow him to a side chamber. The group entered a modest hall lined with benches, a far cry from the grand throne rooms of old. Tyrion signaled for a pair of council guards to keep the door. Once everyone was settled, Jon recounted the tale again, sparing no detail of the cult's rituals, the monstrous summons, and the threat to the free folk. Tyrion's face paled. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the edge of a table, occasionally pausing Jon to clarify a detail. When Jon finished, Tyrion took a deep breath. "It seems the gods love their cycles of doom. You're certain this isn't some overblown tale? Your own eyes saw these creatures." Jon's jaw tightened. "Yes, I fought them, felt the cold, saw them tear men apart. I wouldn't be here otherwise. Tyrion exhaled. Very well. The question is, can the councils be convinced to mount a large-scale expedition north? Many delegates are already complaining of scarce resources, rebuilding costs, and local banditry. They'll be reluctant to commit funds and soldiers to a distant threat. They've grown used to relative peace, however fragile it is. Jon's frustration flared. Then remind them of the White Walkers. Remind them of what nearly happened to the entire realm. Peace means nothing if we allow a new threat to fester until it's unstoppable. Tyrion nodded. I agree with you, but these men and women aren't always swayed by reason alone. We'll need a strategy. Some might recall your part in saving the world from the dead. Others may only recall that you're the man who slew their queen. Jon stiffened, haunted by the memory. If they resent me, so be it. Let them resent me while they march. I only care about preventing another disaster. He paused, trying to remain calm. What of Bran? Does he hold any influence as king of the Six Kingdoms? Or is that title effectively gone? Tyrion sighed. Bran sees many things, but he has grown distant, spending more and more time lost in his visions. He remains a symbolic head, but in truth, the realm is governed by these regional councils. They meet here to coordinate trade, justice, and defense. Bran rarely intervenes. Tyrion gave Jon a long look. Some say the realm has no need of a single monarch anymore. Still, if we could get him to support your cause, it might sway the uncertain. I'll try. Jon pressed his lips together. Then what do we do first? Tyrion rose from his seat, pacing. We call an emergency assembly. Present your testimony. Bring forth any witnesses you can. Use the authority of your name, show them the scars on your men. We'll need to be persuasive. Some council members might see it as a chance to unify. Others might see it as a burden. We can emphasize that if they ignore this, they risk repeating the long night. Jon nodded. I'll do whatever I must. There isn't much time. Tyrion placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, a faint glimmer of the old friendship in his eyes. You've returned. To save them once again, it seems, that alone might carry weight. Thus began a whirlwind of meetings. Tyrion moved quickly, notifying the Central Assembly that urgent matters of realm defense required an immediate session. The delegates grumbled, but they attended, filling a large hall that had once been a reception area for the Targaryen court. Now, its walls were hung with banners of various regions, and rough-hewn benches replaced the plush seats of a royal audience chamber. Jon stood at the forefront, a hush settling as the delegates recognized him. A man in the sigil of House Royce whispered something to a companion. Eyes narrowed. Others, familiar faces from the north, the Reach, the Stormlands, watched with cautious interest. Tyrion opened the assembly with a succinct introduction, then ceded the floor to Jon. Jon cleared his throat. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, but he forced himself to meet the delegates' eyes. He recounted the story once more. The far north tribes under siege, the monstrous powers summoned by a cult, the risk that it might spread if unchecked. He described the gruesome details of the attacks. Around the hall, uneasy shifts and mutters broke out. He had their attention, but not necessarily their agreement. Several delegates interrupted with questions. How do we know this threat won't remain in the far north, preying only on the free folk? Why should we devote men and gold to a place beyond the realm's borders? Haven't the White Walkers been destroyed? Is this not some smaller band of savages? Jon's temper flared at some of these callous remarks, but he kept his voice steady. We asked the same questions before the long night. We learned the hard way that threats from beyond the wall never stay there forever. If these cultists master foul magic, they won't be satisfied with scraps of ice and scattered tribes. Sooner or later, they'll hunger for more. By then, it may be too late to stop them. More murmurs. A few delegates seemed swayed, nodding in worry, while others scowled in skepticism. One man in bright red breeches, representing a coalition from the Westerlands, rose and declared, "We have bandits harassing our trade routes, towns needing reconstruction. The coffers are not bottomless, Lord Snow. Jon took a breath, determined to remain calm. I understand, but I'm not asking you to empty your coffers. I'm asking you to send a united force, maybe a fraction of each region's men, north to investigate and, if necessary, eradicate this threat. If it turns out to be false alarm, you'll have lost little. But if it's real, you could save the realm. At that, a stout woman from the Reach stood. I fought at the Battle of Winterfell. I saw what the dead were capable of. Are you suggesting these cultists could be just as devastating? Jon met her gaze. I don't know if they can raise the dead, but I saw unnatural creatures that nearly killed us all. If they expand, it could be a war we're not prepared to fight alone. Tyrion stepped in smoothly, reinforcing Jon's points, reminding the delegates that the realm had never been more interdependent. He argued that a show of unity would strengthen the new council system. If they failed to address a looming crisis, it would shatter faith in collective governance. The debate stretched on for hours, delegates weighing the costs, the dangers, the logistics. Jon's frustration rose with each condescending remark or question about what the free folk could possibly offer in return. He wanted to shout that it didn't matter, that these were lives at stake, not coin. But he forced himself to endure, trusting Tyrion's skill in negotiation to guide them. Finally, late in the evening, the assembly reached a tentative agreement. They would send a fact-finding company of troops and investigators north, with a pledge that if their findings confirmed Jon's warnings, each region would commit a portion of their forces to a joint army under a single command structure, at least for the duration of dealing with the cult. Several delegates grumbled, but enough agreed to create a majority. Jon exhaled, relief mingling with exhaustion. It was not a perfect victory, but it was a start. Outside the hall, Tyrion walked beside Jon, sounding measured. It's the best we can expect from them for now. Once your company returns with proof, assuming they live, the councils will have a harder time stalling. Jon nodded. I'll go with the company myself. I want them to see the threat firsthand. Tyrion pursed his lips. You're certain? You've done enough, Jon. Let these soldiers see for themselves. Jon shook his head. I won't stand by. This is my fight too. And, if I'm not there, they may not fully realize the danger. Plus, Tormund and the free folk know me. They'll coordinate better if I'm present. Tyrion sighed, then offered a small, resigned grin. Of course you're going. I should have known. In the following days, arrangements were made. Each major region contributed a small contingent. The Vale sent a dozen knights under Lord Grafton's banner. The Riverlands sent a party of longbowmen. The Reach contributed riders. The Stormlands sent foot soldiers, and so forth. Dorne, wary as ever, pledged only a handful of observers. The overall group numbered close to 200, with supplies, pack horses, and a few maesters. Tyrion coordinated their departure, ensuring they had enough gear for the cold. It was a far cry from the grand army that had once assembled at Winterfell to face the undead, but it was enough to investigate. If proof was found, more troops could follow. Jon met the company outside the city walls, where wagons were being loaded and knights checked their saddles. He recognized a few faces from previous battles, men and women who had once fought under the banner of King in the north or Daenerys Targaryen. Now they wore the crests of new houses or carried badges marking them as delegates of the council. A tall captain approached Jon and saluted stiffly. Ser Alvard of the Stormlands, assigned to lead the vanguard. We're at your service, Lord Snow. Jon offered a curt nod. Just Jon will do. I'm not your lord, but I appreciate your willingness to march north. Alvard gave a polite cough. All the same, we've heard enough stories to know you've commanded men in dire situations. We'll heed your counsel. Jon scanned the ranks. Good. We'll head to Winterfell first. We may reinforce or gather more supplies there, then push beyond the wall. Tyrion approached, wearing a cloak lined with fur. He extended a hand to Jon. The realm owes you again, Jon Snow. May the gods grant you success and a bit of luck. If all goes well, I'll follow with a larger force once the councils confirm the threat. Jon clasped his forearm firmly. You have my thanks. I'll send ravens the moment we know more. Let's hope we can stop this before it spirals out of control. They exchanged a respectful nod. Then Jon swung onto his horse, Ghost at his side. The soldiers and scouts formed ranks, and they set off northward. The clatter of hooves echoed on the old King's Road, and for a moment, Jon felt a strange sense of nostalgia for the armies he had once marched with. He thought of the men he'd lost, the battles he'd fought, the unstoppable wave of the dead they'd repelled. Would this be any different? The journey to Winterfell took nearly 2 weeks, slowed by supply wagons and the diverse composition of the force. Along the way, Jon tried to instill a sense of shared purpose, reminding them that they weren't just a band of sellswords or a royal army, but a coalition representing every corner of Westeros. Some were receptive. Others grumbled about seeing no reason to risk their lives for free folk. Jon did his best to quell such talk, but prejudice died hard. He found himself leaning on the stories of how the free folk fought valiantly against the undead, how they saved southern lives more than once. When they finally reached Winterfell's gates, Sansa stood in greeting, relief plain on her face at the sight of Jon's strong escort. She welcomed the company warmly, offering the best accommodations available. The presence of a significant southern force caused some murmurs among the northerners, but Sansa's endorsement helped keep things calm. Jon spent only a few days coordinating with Sansa, discussing strategy, finalizing the supply lines for the upcoming march beyond the wall. He could sense some of the southern soldiers were daunted by the idea of venturing into that frozen land. Northern nights were cold enough for them. The old terror of the White Walkers lingered in collective memory. Though that threat was gone, fear of the unknown remained strong. At last, they pressed on to Castle Black, where the Black brothers once more opened the gates. This time, they stared in amazement at the small army trailing behind Jon, tents and wagons forming a temporary camp outside the wall. Jon spoke to the acting Lord Commander, a man named Herrick, no relation to the Frostmoon Elder, and explained their mission. Herrick's eyes went wide at the mention of monstrous cultists. He told Jon that Shalora had passed through again, heading north with a message from Tormund about ongoing battles, scattered raids from the cult, and sightings of those tall creatures near other tribes. The situation was deteriorating. Jon wasted no time. He led the combined force through the gate the next morning. For many, it was their first time beyond the wall. Nervous tension filled the ranks as they trudged into the barren tundra. Even though it was late in the season, the north was locked in perpetual cold. Snow stretched to every horizon. The wind howled over ice-strewn plains. A sense of foreboding fell upon the coalition soldiers, who huddled in cloaks, glancing warily at the vast white emptiness. The march north proved grueling. Jon forced himself to recall every bit of knowledge gleaned from his time with the Watch and the Free Folk. He set a strict pace, ensured watchers were posted at all times, and listened to the local guides for the best trails. They encountered pockets of free folk along the way who joined or guided them, grateful that a force of armed Southerners had actually come. Jon heard more tales of horrors. Entire clans found butchered, bizarre runes painted in blood on ice walls, sightings of the tall creatures prowling the edges of storms. The tension in the army grew, but at least now they had proof that something dire awaited them. They found Tormund at the Frostmoon camp, which had swelled to host multiple tribes forced to retreat from the deeper ice fields. Makeshift fortifications ringed the area, stakes carved from wood, watchtowers made of stacked stones. Tormund gave a bark of laughter upon seeing Jon, though it was tinged with relief. "You actually brought Southerners north again, you mad bastard." Jon allowed himself a small smile. They needed convincing. Hopefully they're ready for what's out here. Tormund's grin faded as he surveyed the assembled soldiers. "We've lost more clans. The attacks come randomly, sometimes with only a handful of cultists, sometimes with those tall beasts. We've tried to fortify, but we can't just cower here forever." Elder Harrick appeared, leaning heavily on his staff, eyes flicking between Jon and the southern banners. "You have returned with an army. The tribes will fight with you if that is your plan." Shalora spoke of an old rumor that the cult's main gathering place might be deep within the glacier tunnels beyond the northern ridge. Jon turned to the delegates who'd come with him. Ser Alvard frowned. "We're to take our men into an underground glacier labyrinth?" Jon nodded grimly. If that's where the threat is strongest, that's where we must strike. Better to face them head-on than wait for them to pick us off in raids. Some of the soldiers shifted uneasily at the thought of plunging into icy caverns, but others, bolstered by the presence of so many allies, set their jaws in determination. Tormund gripped Jon's shoulder. "When do we march?" Jon gazed around at the tired faces, the fearful eyes of the free folk, and the cautious stares of the southern knights. Beyond them lay a horizon of white, soon to be stained with blood if they failed. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "We'll rest tonight, plan our approach. Tomorrow we end this cult or die trying." The gathered warriors murmured their assent, tension thick in the icy air. Jon caught Tormund's eye, and the big man gave him a nod, a silent promise that they stood together. Ghost prowled at Jon's side, as if sensing the storm about to break. Jon swallowed hard. He thought of Daenerys, of the war against the dead, of every sacrifice that had been made so Westeros could have peace. And here he was, once more on the brink of battle with an unearthly foe. Perhaps he truly was destined to keep fighting until the land was safe, or until he was finally laid to rest. The gods, if they cared at all, had set him on this path a long time ago. That night, Jon took a brief walk outside the camp, Ghost padding along. The sky overhead was vast and shimmering with distant stars. The wind carried the faint smell of pine and the sharper tang of ice. He found himself whispering a quiet prayer to whatever powers might listen. A prayer for strength, for unity, and for the hope that this would be the last battle he would ever have to fight for the sake of the realm. He had never been devout, but in that moment, he longed for a sign that he was not alone in this. No voice answered, only the gentle rustle of the wind over snow. Morning arrived, gray and cold. The assembled force mustered at the edge of the camp, columns of knights, archers, and spear-wielding free folk. The uneasy alliance was visible in every detail. Southern steel armor alongside northern leather and furs, house sigils next to free folk tattoos. But for better or worse, they marched as one. Jon stood at the front, Tormund to his right, Ser Alvord to his left. Ghost trotted ahead, sniffing the wind. Shalora joined them as well, having returned in the night with scouts' reports of cultist activity near the glacier's entrance. They set off. The plan was to reach the northern ridge by midday, where the scouts claimed to have found a massive crevasse leading into underground caverns. The cult apparently favored that entrance for their rituals, as old paths in the ice had been carved by centuries of slow shifting. If they could find the cult's main encampment inside the glacier, they could strike a decisive blow, hopefully dispatching the priest or priests responsible for summoning those tall monsters. As they approached the ridge, the wind picked up, blowing flurries of snow into swirling eddies. The sun, never strong in these lands, disappeared behind thick gray clouds. Jon tasted a storm on the air, an ominous sign. He ordered the men to tighten formation. The ridge loomed taller with each step, an imposing wall of ice and rock. Ghost let out a soft growl, muzzle lifted. Shalora pointed to a wide crack in the ice, almost invisible from a distance. "That is the entrance." The scouts said it's passable, though it slopes downward. Jon called the vanguard to halt while the archers and free folk skirmishers prepared to move ahead. If the cult lay in wait, he wanted to avoid being ambushed in a narrow passage. Tormund stroked his beard, eyes scanning the swirling snow. "I smell trouble." Jon nodded. "Keep your wits. We can't afford chaos." They advanced slowly into the crevasse, forced to proceed two abreast at most. The walls of ice rose on either side, shimmering with a faint blue luminescence. Drips echoed in the frigid silence, as rivulets of meltwater trickled down unseen channels. The deeper they went, the darker it grew. Torches were lit, casting flickering shadows on the icy walls. A hush settled over the soldiers, each footstep sounding alarmingly loud in the confined space. Minutes turned to an hour as they descended further. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger caverns where spires of ice jutted from the ground like teeth. Stalactites of frozen water glimmered overhead. At every turn, they expected an ambush, but none came. Jon's unease grew. The cult must know they were coming, or at least sense that a large force had entered their domain. Where were they? Finally, the passage widened into a vast chamber that seemed carved by some ancient glacier shift. Torchlight revealed rough walls of ice that refracted the flames in eerie patterns. Massive pillars supported the ceiling, formed over millennia by ice flows. On the far side of the chamber, faint shapes moved. Jon raised a hand, halting the column. A chill ran down his spine as he made out the forms of masked figures, scattered behind the pillars. One of them stood taller, staff in hand, topped by that same bleached skull with antlers. A low chant began to echo, reverberating through the ice. The language was as alien and harsh as before. The cultists stepped forward, brandishing twisted blades. Jon drew Longclaw, feeling the tension coil in his body. Tormund hefted his axe with a grim smile. The knights and archers readied themselves. Suddenly, a piercing cry split the air, unlike anything human. The ceiling shook, sending shards of ice crashing down. From the shadows, two monstrous creatures emerged. Those tall, sinewy horrors with horns of ice. Their eyes glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. The assembled soldiers flinched at the sheer presence of them. Archers, Ser Alvord bellowed. At once, a volley of arrows streaked across the cavern, many striking the creatures and the cultists. Some cultists fell, screeching. But the monsters barely staggered, pulling arrows from their pale flesh and roaring in defiance. The chant rose in intensity. The priest raised the skull staff, and an icy wind howled through the chamber, as if from nowhere. Torches guttered and threatened to extinguish. The ground trembled. Jon remembered the quake at the basin. "Charge!" he yelled, determined to break their formation before they could conjure worse horrors. Chaos erupted. Knights surged forward, swords flashing, crashing into the cultist line. Free folk spearmen darted between pillars, jabbing at robed figures. Tormund let out a wild war cry, burying his axe in a masked man's shoulder. Ghost leapt onto a cultist who tried to flank Jon, tearing him down in a spray of blood. Arrows hissed overhead, some finding their marks in robed bodies. Jon fought at the vanguard, Longclaw cutting through a blade aimed at his neck. The cultist behind that blade let out an inhuman hiss, returning with a frantic slash. Jon parried, then countered with a thrust that took the masked figure in the chest. Even mortally wounded, they tried to chant something, spitting blood. Jon pressed on. Nearby, one of the tall creatures snatched up a knight in a single clawed hand, lifting him off the ground. Despite the knight's armor, the creature's grip crushed him like a toy. Another soldier slashed at the creature's leg, drawing blackish fluid. The monster roared, swatting the soldier aside. A volley of arrows rained upon it, some embedding in its neck. At last, the beast stumbled, gargling a hideous cry, before toppling with a ground-shaking crash. Jon spotted the priest behind a pillar, chanting in that guttural language, staff held high. A swirl of icy mist gathered around them, coalescing into shapes that almost resembled small, shambling figures made of frost. Jon's heart lurched. They looked akin to wights, but formed of ice instead of corpses. The frost creatures lurched forward, attacking the nearest soldiers with chilling touch that froze armor and flesh. Eldiers screamed as their limbs went numb, swords clattering to the ground. Tormund hacked one apart, cursing at the biting cold that stung his hands. The second tall creature charged the archers, scattering them. Shalora speared a cultist through the back, then whirled to see the monstrous being looming overhead. She ducked a swiping claw and rolled away. Ghost leapt for the creature's leg, teeth sinking in. The beast roared and kicked, sending Ghost tumbling. Jon's vision flared with rage, and he rushed forward, cutting down another cultist to reach the monster. He slashed at the creature's ankle, burying Longclaw deep in its pale flesh. A shriek of fury echoed from the beast, but it didn't fall. Instead, it swung a massive arm at Jon. He barely rolled aside, feeling the gust of air as the blow smashed the ice behind him. Wrestling with panic, Jon focused on the priest. If the chanting and staff commanded these creatures, perhaps killing the priest would break their magic. He shouted to Tormund, "Cover me!" Tormund nodded, smashing a frost creature aside. Jon sprinted around the pillars, slipping on slick patches of ice, fending off a robed cultist who lunged from the shadows. With a swift stroke, Jon disarmed him, then bashed him with the pommel of his sword, sending the cultist sprawling. He found the priest standing in a circle of swirling mist, eyes gleaming behind a bone mask. The staff glowed with an unearthly light. As Jon approached, the priest hissed a string of syllables that made the air vibrate. A wave of freezing wind knocked Jon back, nearly ripping the sword from his hand. He staggered, teeth chattering, forcing himself to remain upright. The priest advanced, raising the staff as if to strike. Jon braced, swinging Longclaw upward. The blades met in a shower of sparks. Some unholy magic in the staff deflected Valyrian steel. Jon's arms ached from the impact. He pressed forward, pushing the staff aside. The priest let out a guttural screech and spat a curse. In that moment, Jon saw a flicker of fear in those eyes. He pressed the advantage, hacking at the staff's base. A blinding flash erupted, throwing Jon backward. His ears rang and he hit the ice hard. Spots danced in his vision. The staff had partially splintered, but still the priest clung to it. The swirling mist intensified, shaping the silhouette of yet another tall creature in the air itself. Jon groaned, forcing himself up. If this madness continued, they'd be overrun. The entire realm might be threatened by such monstrous conjurations. With a final surge of adrenaline, Jon lunged, ignoring the biting cold that tore at his exposed skin. Longclaw met the staff again. For a heartbeat, their weapons locked. Then Jon poured all his strength into a savage downward cut. Valyrian steel cleaved through the staff. The skull with antlers snapped away, shattering on the ice. A keening wail burst from the priest's lips as the swirling mist collapsed. The creature forming in midair dissipated into shards of ice. Jon seized the opening, driving his blade through the priest's chest. The cult leader spasmed, blood soaking the bone mask. With a final hiss, they collapsed. At once, the cavern's atmosphere changed. The howling wind died to a whisper, and the swirling frost dissipated. The frost creatures crumbled into heaps of snow. The tall monster still on its feet let out a tortured roar, then staggered, as though its strength was suddenly sapped. Arrows peppered its hide, and it fell with a thunderous crash. A hush spread, broken only by the panting of wounded soldiers and the drip of melting ice. The remaining cultists recoiled, dropping their weapons or fleeing into the darkness. Knights and free folk gave chase, cutting them down or capturing them. Jon stood over the priest's body, chest heaving, Longclaw slick with blood. The staff lay in pieces, the skull fragment in shards. Something dark and thick oozed from inside that skull, as if it contained a vile liquid. He nudged it with a boot, half expecting some new horror. But it was inert now, the dark fluid congealing on the ice. Tormund stumbled over, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He looked around, eyes wide, then met Jon's gaze. "Is it done?" Jon wiped sweat and blood from his brow, ignoring the throbbing pain in his limbs. "For now, let's see to our wounded." Ghost trotted up, limping slightly but alive, muzzle stained with blood. Jon patted him gratefully, relieved to see the dire wolf breathing. Took hours to search the caverns. A few scattered cultists made desperate stands or tried to hide inside tunnels, but they were outmatched by the combined might of the free folk and southern soldiers. They found old altars, strange runic inscriptions on the walls, piles of bones, evidence of grisly sacrifices. No more tall creatures lurked in the shadows, suggesting that the priest's staff had indeed been the key to summoning them. By the time they emerged from the glacier caves, the air was thick with the stench of death and the moans of the injured. Many good men and women had died, but the threat was quelled. The cult's ritual sites lay destroyed. Outside, the storm had ceased, and a pale sun illuminated the snow. Jon stood on the ridge, overlooking the battered but victorious force. Soldiers tended to their wounds. Free folk retrieved their fallen. Despite the losses, relief was palpable. Tormund trudged up to Jon's side. "We lost some, but we saved far more. These bastards won't be summoning any more ice fiends." Jon nodded, exhaustion in every bone. "We'll return to the Frostmoon camp. Let them know it's done. Then the southern delegates can see that we've eradicated the threat. They'll have the proof they need." Tormund blew out a breath. "Aye, and you'll ride south again, telling the councils? Or are you done with them?" Jon looked out at the endless expanse of white. Clouds drifted across the sky. He thought of how this entire campaign had begun. He had believed himself finished with grand causes and wars. Yet once again, he had carried the realm on his shoulders. The cycle repeated, but perhaps now it could truly end. He took a moment before answering. "I'll see it through," he said quietly. "Report what happened. Make sure they understand that if we hadn't acted, it could have been another long night. After that, I don't know." Tormund clasped his shoulder, nodding in respectful silence. Together, they walked down the ridge to rejoin their battered forces. The wind gusted gently, carrying away the echoes of battle. Jon Snow felt a mix of weariness and relief. He had lived up to the duty thrust upon him once more, overthrowing a threat that claimed dominion through terror. Whether it was a mad king, a self-styled monarch, or a twisted priest of ice, destiny kept casting him as the Liberator. He thought of Daenerys' haunting visage in his dreams. Perhaps, in some way, he was honoring her original intent to break the wheel. But each victory left him more hollow, more certain that his role was to protect the living, no matter the cost. Soon, they would march back across the snowy plains, carrying their wounded and their dead. The tribes would bury their fallen. The southern delegates would return to the councils, triumphant in forging a victory that transcended old boundaries. Jon would stand before them, a living reminder that unity was possible and necessary. Whenever dark forces rose against the realm, and maybe, just maybe, once all was said and done, he could find a quieter life again, far from crowns, far from politics, in the endless hush of the north. He couldn't be sure. The old gods and the new seldom granted him rest. But as the sun broke through the parting clouds and shone on the tattered banners of every region, on free folk standing shoulder to shoulder with knights, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps their victory in these icy depths would serve as a lasting lesson that Westeros did not need a single monarch to stand against the darkness. Perhaps they could rely on shared bonds, an alliance of equals, forged in the crucible of battle. If that was the realm's future, Jon Snow thought he could live with it. There would always be more dangers lurking in the shadows, mortal or mystical. But for now, at least they had one. And if fate had chosen Jon Snow to be its reluctant champion, so be it. He would carry that burden until the realm no longer needed it, or until he could finally lay down his sword and walk into the cold northern wind, a free man at last.